The rain fell in sheets across the rolling hills of Western Virginia, turning the dirt road leading to Everett's old farmhouse into a muddy mess. James Marshall gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup truck, leaning forward as the wipers struggled against the downpour. The foreclosure notice sat on the passenger seat, the red final warning stamp partially visible beneath his worn leather wallet. 48 years old with calloused hands and deepening lines around his eyes, James had never imagined ending it up here, 3 months behind on payments for the land his grandfather had purchased with cash 7 decades ago. But life had other plans. First came Mary's cancer diagnosis, then the crushing medical bills, and finally her funeral expenses. The savings were gone, his carpentry business was struggling, and now the bank wanted their due. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Emma. "Dad, don't forget to sign those papers before Monday. Love you." James sighed heavily. Emma was 23, teaching history at the local high school, and worried sick about him. She'd been trying to help with bills since Mary passed 2 years ago, but James kept refusing. This wasn't her burden to bear. The farmhouse appeared through the rain as James rounded the final bend, a 2-story colonial with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. It wasn't much to look at anymore, but it was home, the only home Emma had ever known, and the place where Mary had taken her last breath. Inside, James shook off the rain and tossed the foreclosure notice onto a pile of bills on the kitchen table. He had exactly 17 days to come up with $43,000, or the Marshall family would lose everything. His contractor business had dried up with the economy, and no bank would approve a loan given his credit situation. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders as he sank into a kitchen chair. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, the sound echoing through the quiet house. It had belonged to his great-grandfather, one of the few family heirlooms still in his possession. Most had been sold over the past year to keep afloat. James rubbed his face with rough hands and was about to reach for the bottle of bourbon in the cupboard when headlights swept across the front windows. A sleek black sedan pulled up beside his truck, looking comically out of place on the rural property. James frowned, not recognizing the vehicle. The doorbell rang a moment later. On his porch stood a man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit that the rain hadn't dared to touch. Tall and lean with silver hair and sharp eyes, he carried a leather briefcase in an air of authority. "James Marshall?" The man's voice was deep, refined with the subtle hint of a southern accent. "That's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Richard Harrington. I represent the firm of Harrington, Wells and Stone out of Richmond. May I come in? I believe we have matters of importance to discuss." James hesitated. Lawyers rarely brought good news, especially these days. But the rain was coming down harder, and curiosity got the better of him. He stepped aside. Harrington surveyed the modest living room with a neutral expression, taking in the worn furniture and faded photographs. His gaze lingered on a Civil War-era rifle mounted above the fireplace. "That's an 1861 Springfield. Family heirloom?" he asked. James nodded. "My great-great-grandfather carried it at Gettysburg. One of the few things I haven't had to sell off yet." Something flickered in Harrington's eyes. Approval, perhaps. He set his briefcase on the coffee table and sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Marshall, are you familiar with the name Charles Everett?" James frowned, searching his memory. "Can't say that I am." "He was your great-grandmother's brother. Died in 1943. Harrington opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "I've been trying to locate you for several months now." "Why would you be looking for me?" "Because Charles Everett left behind a considerable estate, and you, Mr. Marshall, are his last living heir." James stared at the lawyer, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he shook his head. "There must be some mistake. My family never had money. My grandfather worked the railroads his whole life." "There's no mistake." Harrington extracted a yellowed envelope from the folder. "Your great-grandmother, Eleanor Marshall née Everett, was estranged from her brother after she married your great-grandfather against her family's wishes. Charles never married or had children of his own." James leaned forward, interest piqued despite his skepticism. "So what exactly are we talking about here?" Charles Everett owned a significant amount of property outside Charlottesville, including a historic estate house dating back to 1795. The property has remained in trust since his death, managed by our firm, with specific instructions that it be transferred to Eleanor's descendants on certain conditions. What conditions? Harrington's expression remained carefully neutral. The primary condition was that the heir must be of suitable character as determined by the trustee, which has been our firm for 3 generations now. And you've decided I'm of suitable character? James couldn't keep the bitter edge from his voice. The bank that's about to foreclose on this place might disagree with you. Harrington's eyes flicked to the pile of bills on the kitchen table visible through the doorway. Financial difficulties don't necessarily reflect one's character, Mr. Marshall. Your military service record, your reputation as a craftsman, and your standing in the community speak more to the type of man you are. James felt a chill run down his spine. You've been investigating me. Thoroughly, Harrington confirmed without apology. As I said, I've been trying to locate you for months. The provisions of the trust were quite specific. The lawyer removed a large envelope from his briefcase and slid it across the coffee table. These are the deed transfer documents for Everett Hall and the surrounding 200 acres. The property has been maintained, taxes paid, and is unencumbered by any liens or mortgages. James made no move to touch the envelope. This felt too convenient, too perfect, like winning the lottery the day before losing everything. What's the catch? There are 3 conditions to your inheritance. Harrington raised one finger. First, you must take up residence at Everett Hall within 30 days. A second finger joined the first. Second, you cannot sell the property for a minimum of 5 years. A third finger rose. And third, you must locate and preserve what Charles Everett referred to in his will as the family's true legacy. What does that mean? What legacy? That, Mr. Marshall, is something you'll have to discover for yourself. Charles was deliberately vague, stating only that the heir will know it when they find it. James ran a hand through his graying hair, mind racing. How much is this property worth? The most recent appraisal valued Everett Hall and the land at approximately $7 million, though its historical significance could increase that substantially. $7 million. The number hung in the air between them. More money than James could comprehend. Enough to solve every financial problem he had ever had and set Emma up for life. This sounds too good to be true, James said finally. People don't just inherit mansions from relatives they've never heard of. Harrington reached into his briefcase again and produced a manila envelope. Perhaps these will convince you. Inside were several sepia-tone photographs. The first showed a grand federal-style mansion with imposing columns and expansive grounds. The second featured a stern-looking man in a 1940s suit standing on the mansion's steps. But it was the third photograph that caught James's breath. A young woman with familiar eyes standing beside a tall man in a World War I uniform. "That's my great-grandmother," James whispered, recognizing her from old family albums. "Eleanor." "Yes, and that's Charles beside her, before their estrangement. This was taken in 1918, shortly before he shipped out to France." James studied the photograph, seeing his own daughter's features in Eleanor's face. The resemblance was striking. "Why now?" he asked finally. "If this inheritance has been waiting since 1943, why are you only finding me now?" Harrington's expression remained unreadable. The terms of the trust specified that the heir must be a direct descendant of Eleanor, must be over 45 years of age, and must demonstrate the virtues Charles held dear, specifically honesty, craftsmanship, and loyalty to family. You turned 48 last month, Mr. Marshall, and our investigation confirms you embody those qualities. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour, its familiar tone grounding James in reality. He looked around the living room, at the faded curtains Mary had sewn, the bookshelf he'd built when Emma was born, the worn spot on the carpet where their old dog used to sleep. Could he really leave it all behind? "I'd need to talk to my daughter," he said finally. "This affects her too." "Of course." Harrington closed his briefcase and stood. "I'll leave these documents with you to review. There's a business card with my contact information inside." He paused at the door. "I should mention, Mr. Marshall, that the trust pays all transfer costs, moving expenses, and provides a monthly stipend for property maintenance. You would be stepping into a fully funded situation." James followed him to the door, mind still reeling. Why would he do this? Leave everything to someone he'd never meet? Harrington turned, his expression softening for the first time. Charles Everett lost everything that mattered to him during his lifetime. His sister to estrangement, his fiancée to the Spanish flu epidemic, his closest friends to the Great War. What remained was property and wealth, but no one to share it with. I believe he wanted to ensure that some part of his legacy would continue, even if he couldn't witness it himself. With that, the lawyer stepped into the rain and was gone before James could formulate another question. Emma arrived the next morning, her small car kicking up gravel as she parked beside her father's truck. She found James at the kitchen table, surrounded by the documents Harrington had left, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. He'd been up most of the night, reading and rereading the inheritance papers, looking for the trap, the hidden clause, the fine print that would reveal this all as too good to be true. "Dad?" Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Petite like her mother, with the same chestnut hair and determined chin, she glanced at the papers with concern. "What's all this?" James explained about Harrington's visit and the unexpected inheritance. As he spoke, Emma's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. "I looked up Everett Hall online," she said when he finished, pulling out her phone to show him. "It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There's not much information available, but it was apparently significant during the Civil War era. The images showed a stately mansion surrounded by ancient oak trees, its architecture a testament to early American craftsmanship. Despite years of maintaining other people's homes, James had never imagined owning something so grand. "This could solve everything, Dad," Emma said quietly. "The foreclosure, your medical bills from that back surgery, everything." "It means leaving this place," James replied, gesturing around them. "Your mother's garden, the marks on the doorframe where we measured your height every birthday, all the memories." Emma's eyes softened. "Mom isn't in the house, Dad. She's here." She touched her heart. "And here," she tapped her head. "We'd take her with us wherever we go." James sighed, knowing she was right. Mary would have been the first to tell him to accept this opportunity, to secure their future rather than cling to the past. Still, doubt lingered. "I called the law firm this morning to verify Harrington's identity," he said. "They confirmed everything, been in business since 18 and specialize in estate law. Seems legitimate." "Then what's holding you back?" James ran a hand over the deed transfer papers. "It feels like there's more to this story. Why all the conditions? Why wait until now? And what is this family legacy I'm supposed to find and preserve?" Emma sat beside him, examining the old photographs. "Maybe that's the point," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe finding those answers is part of the inheritance too." The foreclosure notice caught her eye, and she picked it up, studying the final warning with a frown. "How much time do we have left?" 17 days, James answered. "Not enough to come up with 43,000. "Then it seems to me we don't have much choice," Emma said pragmatically. "We accept this inheritance, move to Charlottesville, and figure out the rest as we go." The decisiveness in her voice reminded James so much of Mary that it made his chest ache. "You'd be leaving your teaching position mid-semester." Emma shrugged. "Charlottesville has schools too, maybe even better ones. And I've been wanting to pursue my doctorate in American history. The University of Virginia would be perfect for that." The rain had finally stopped, sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast dappled patterns across the kitchen floor. James stood and walked to the window, looking out at the property his family had called home for generations. The barn needed a new roof. The tractor hadn't run in months. The fields hadn't been planted in years. Truth be told, he'd been barely hanging on here even before Mary got sick. "All right," he said finally, turning back to Emma. "Let's do it. Let's accept the inheritance." Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in months. "I think this is the right decision, Dad. I really do." "I hope so, sweetheart." James picked up Harrington's business card. "Because I have a feeling our lives are about to change in ways we can't even imagine." 3 weeks later, James stood in the circular driveway of Everett Hall, staring up at his new home with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The reality was even more impressive than the photographs. A 3-story federal-style mansion with imposing columns, expansive windows, and intricate brickwork that had weathered nearly 2 centuries of Virginia seasons. Emma had already bounded up the front steps, eager to explore. Their belongings, what little they decided to keep, would arrive by moving truck the following day. For tonight, they were entering this new chapter with just a suitcase each and the weight of their own expectations. Harrington met them at the massive front door, keys in hand. "Welcome to Everett Hall, Mr. Marshall," he offered a thin smile. "Or should I say, welcome home." The interior was like stepping back in time, gleaming hardwood floors, soaring ceilings, and period furnishings that must have been worth a fortune. Portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women lined the central hallway, all bearing some resemblance to the Everett siblings from the old photograph. The house has been maintained by a caretaker who lives in the cottage on the edge of the property, Harrington explained as he led them through the ground floor. Mrs. Sullivan has worked for the trust for nearly 30 years. She comes in 3 times a week to clean and maintains the grounds with her son. James nodded, still trying to process the grandeur surrounding him. The formal dining room could seat 20. The library contained more books than he'd ever seen outside a public building. The kitchen, while updated with modern appliances, still featured the original massive hearth where meals would have been prepared in the 18th century. "It's magnificent," Emma breathed, trailing her fingers along a marble fireplace mantel. "I can't believe this belongs to us now." "The deed transfer was completed yesterday," Harrington confirmed. "The property is now officially in your name, Mr. Marshall, with Ms. Marshall as the secondary beneficiary." James had insisted on Emma being included in all the legal documents. If something happened to him, she would inherit everything without complication. "And the stipend you mentioned?" James asked, practical concerns asserting themselves despite the splendor. $5,000 monthly, deposited directly to the account you provided for maintenance and upkeep of the property. The first payment has already been processed. Harrington handed him a leather-bound folder. "This contains all the relevant information about the property, insurance documents, utility accounts, service providers, and historical documentation." James accepted the folder, still waiting for the catch, the hidden clause, the revelation that would expose this all as an elaborate hoax. But Harrington merely checked his watch and moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to get settled. Mrs. Sullivan will arrive tomorrow morning to help orient you to the property's operations. My contact information is in the folder should you need anything else." He paused at the threshold. "Oh, and Mr. Marshall, Charles's study is on the second floor east wing. You might want to start your search there." "Search," James frowned. "For the family legacy," Harrington reminded him, "the third condition of your inheritance." With that cryptic suggestion, the lawyer departed, leaving James and Emma alone in their new, impossibly grand home. That night, after exploring until their feet ached, they sat on the veranda overlooking gardens that stretched toward distant hills. The spring air was heavy with the scent of magnolias, and fireflies winked in the gathering darkness. "I keep expecting to wake up," Emma said, sipping tea from a delicate china cup they'd found in the kitchen. "This doesn't feel real." James nodded, understanding completely. Just 3 weeks ago, he'd been facing financial ruin. Now he owned a historic mansion worth millions. The whiplash of fortune was disorienting. "I want to see Charles's study tomorrow," he said. "See if we can figure out what this family legacy might be." "I've been thinking about that." Emma leaned forward, her historian's mind clearly engaged. "The house dates back to 1795, which means the Everett family was here during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. In both world wars, there could be historical artifacts, documents, even valuable collections." "Harrington said I'd know it when I found it," James mused, "which suggests it's something significant, something that would stand out." Emma yawned, the long day finally catching up with her. "Whatever it is, it's waited 80 years. It can wait until morning." James kissed the top of her head, feeling a surge of gratitude that they were facing this strange new chapter together. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. We've got a lot to discover tomorrow." Morning brought Mrs. Sullivan, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and knowing eyes. She showed no surprise at their modest appearance or obvious discomfort with their new surroundings. "The house has been waiting for you," she said matter-of-factly, as she demonstrated how to operate the surprisingly modern kitchen. "Nearly 80 years with no family inside. It needs people, voices, life." "Did you know Charles Everett?" James asked, accepting the coffee she offered. Mrs. Sullivan shook her head. "I started here in 1993. By then, the trust had been managing the property for 50 years. She hesitated, then added, "But my grandmother worked here when Mr. Everett was alive. She said he was a good man but troubled. Haunted was the word she used." "Haunted by what?" Emma asked. Historian's curiosity piqued. "By loss, I expect. By the past." Mrs. Sullivan moved efficiently around the kitchen, checking supplies. "This house has seen its share of tragedy over the centuries." James exchanged glances with Emma, sensing there were stories beneath the caretaker's measured words. But Mrs. Sullivan had already moved on, explaining the heating system and where to find circuit breakers. After she left, promising to return in 2 days, James and Emma made their way to Charles's study. The room was exactly as one might imagine a wealthy man's sanctuary from the 1940s. Leather chairs worn to a rich patina, shelves of first edition books, a massive oak desk positioned to catch the morning light. "It doesn't look like anything's been touched since he died," Emma observed, running a finger along the desk's surface and finding it dust-free thanks to Mrs. Sullivan's diligence. James moved to the desk, noting the fine craftsmanship. As a carpenter, he appreciated the dovetail joints, the hand-carved details, the perfect proportions. "This is museum quality," he murmured. The desk drawers were unlocked, containing what one might expect: fountain pens, stationery, ledgers with elegant handwriting recording household expenses from the 1930s and early 40s. Nothing that screamed family legacy. Emma gravitated toward the bookshelves, examining titles. First editions of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck. These alone are worth thousands. James nodded absently, his attention caught by a portrait above the fireplace. Charles Everett, in his prime, perhaps 40, standing beside a gleaming black Packard automobile. There was something in his expression, a distant sadness behind the confident pose. "He looks lonely," James said softly. Emma joined him, studying the portrait. "He lost his sister to estrangement, his fiancée to disease, his friends to war. I'd be lonely too." James moved closer to the painting, something about the background catching his attention. "Is that a different house behind him?" Emma squinted. "You're right, that's not Everett Hall. The architecture is different, more Gothic revival than Federal." "So where is it? And why is it in his portrait?" They searched the study more carefully now, looking for clues about the mysterious second house. Emma found a leather-bound photo album in a bottom drawer of a side table, its pages filled with images of Charles throughout his life. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photograph of a young Charles in a military uniform. "This was taken at that other house. You can see the distinctive windows in the background." They continued to draw the album for their album, finding more images of the Gothic revival house, including several interior shots showing ornate woodwork and stained glass. In most, Charles stood with a striking young woman whose expression varied from serious to playful. "His fiancée, maybe?" James suggested. Emma nodded, turning to a page where someone had written, "Charles and Elizabeth, spring 1918, beneath a photo of the couple in a garden. Elizabeth must be the fiancée who died in the Spanish flu epidemic," she said softly. "Harrington mentioned she died young." The final pages of the album contained newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. One headline jumped out: "Everett heir purchases controversial property," dated September 1919. The article detailed Charles's purchase of a estate called Thornfield Hall, described as the infamous former home of Confederate General Robert Thornfield, rumored to contain significant Confederate treasures hidden during the final days of the Civil War. "A Thornfield Hall," Emma repeated, eyes widening. "That must be the Gothic house in these photos." James frowned. "But if Charles owned two properties, why isn't Thornfield Hall mentioned in the inheritance?" They continued searching, finding nothing else about the mysterious second property until James noticed a small key taped to the inside back cover of the album. Old and ornate, it looked like it might open a jewelry box or small chest. "What do you think this opens?" he asked, carefully removing the fragile tape. Emma shook her head. "No idea, but it must be important if it was hidden like this." They spent the next hour searching the study for anything the key might fit, finally discovering a locked compartment behind a false panel in the desk. Inside was a single envelope, addressed simply, "To my heir." James's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, unfolding pages of elegant handwriting dated October 15, 1943, just 2 weeks before Charles Everett's death. To the heir of Everett Hall, he read aloud, if you are reading this, then Harrington and his firm have determined you worthy of the Everett legacy. I can only hope they have chosen wisely, for what I entrust to you now is far more significant than mere property or wealth. Emma moved closer, peering over his shoulder as he continued. The true Everett legacy lies not in this house, fine though it may be, but in the redemption of a great wrong committed by our family during the nation's darkest hour. My father, Jonathan Everett, was a successful businessman who made his fortune supplying both Union and Confederate forces during the Civil War, a fact he concealed by using different company names for each side. He was a war profiteer, Emma whispered, selling to both sides. James nodded grimly and read on. In the final days of the war, as Richmond fell and Confederate forces retreated, a desperate general, Robert Thornfield, entrusted my father with a collection of immense historical and financial value. Artifacts, documents, and gold intended to fund a Confederate government in exile. My father swore to protect these items until they could be safely recovered. But instead, James continued, he betrayed that trust. When Thornfield was killed at Appomattox days later, my father claimed the collection as spoils of war. He used a portion of the gold to expand his businesses, becoming one of Virginia's wealthiest men by the turn of the century. The rest of the collection, including irreplaceable historical documents and family heirlooms belonging to many of Virginia's oldest families, he concealed. Emma's eyes were wide. So the Everett fortune was built on stolen Confederate treasure? James continued reading, his voice growing tighter. I discovered the truth only after my father's death in 1915, when I found his private journals. By then, our family's reputation and fortune were firmly established. I was raised to believe we were pillars of Virginia society, our wealth honestly earned. The revelation shattered everything I thought I knew about our family. When I returned from France in 1919, I used my inheritance to purchase Thornfield Hall, the ruined estate of the man my father had betrayed. I intended to find whatever remained of the collection and restore it to its rightful owners or their descendants. For years I searched the property, finding only fragments and clues. The Spanish flu took my beloved Elizabeth before our search was complete, and my enthusiasm for the quest died with her. The letter continued, detailing Charles's decades of guilt and his eventual decision to establish the trust that would pass both properties to a worthy heir. Thornfield Hall and Everett Hall are two halves of one legacy, the letter concluded. One represents our family's shame, the other our redemption. I have arranged for you to inherit both, though Harrington will only reveal Everett Hall initially. This is my final test of your character. If you are the person I hope, you will discover Thornfield Hall on your own and understand what must be done. The true legacy awaits you there, hidden where only someone with both moral compass and craftsman's eye would think to look. May you succeed where I failed. The letter was signed simply Charles Everett, with a postscript. The second key is in the place where time stands still but never stops moving. James and Emma sat in stunned silence, the weight of Charles's confession hanging in the air between them. This is incredible, Emma finally whispered. A hidden Confederate treasury, stolen by our ancestor, that might still be out there somewhere. James reread the postscript. The place where time stands still but never stops moving. He looked up suddenly. The grandfather clock. It has to be. They hurried downstairs to the massive grandfather clock in the main hallway, an impressive piece at least 8 feet tall with intricate carvings and a moon phase dial. James carefully opened the case, examining the weights and pendulum. There, Emma pointed to a small brass key taped to the inside of the case, similar to the one they had found in the album, but slightly larger. James removed it carefully. So we have 2 keys, but what do they open? And where is Thornfield Hall? Emma was already pulling out her phone. Let me search for it. If it's a historic property, there should be records. After several minutes of searching, her expression fell. Nothing. No current listing for a Thornfield Hall in Virginia. The only references are in historical documents about Civil War-era properties. Maybe it was demolished, James suggested. Or renamed? Possible, but then why would Charles include it in our inheritance? Emma continued searching, trying different keywords until she let out a small gasp. Wait, I found something, a news article from 1975 about historic preservation efforts in Albemarle County. It mentions the former Thornfield Hall, now operating as the Rosemont Bed and Breakfast. James looked over her shoulder at the small article. That's not much to go on, but it's something. Emma switched to a map application. Rosemont B&B. There it is, about 15 miles from here, just outside the town of Milton. They exchanged determined looks, both feeling the pull of Charles's unfinished quest. Grab those keys, James said, reaching for his truck keys. Let's go to see if Thornfield Hall is still standing. The drive to Milton took them through rolling countryside dotted with horse farms and vineyards. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape as they followed the GPS directions to Rosemont. I still don't understand why Harrington didn't mention Thornfield Hall, James said as they drove. If it's part of the inheritance, why keep it secret? Charles's letter said it was a test, Emma reminded him, to see if we'd discover it ourselves. Seems like an unnecessary complication, James grumbled, though he had to admit the mystery had captured his imagination. They rounded a bend, and Emma gasped. Dad, look! Rising from a grove of ancient oak trees stood a Gothic revival mansion straight out of the photographs. 3 stories of weathered stone with pointed arches, ornate trim, and a distinctive tower at one corner. A discreet sign at the entrance read, Rosemont Inn, historic accommodations since 1969. That's it, Emma whispered. That's Thornfield Hall. James parked in the small lot beside the mansion, noting the well-maintained grounds and fresh paint on the trim. Whatever its past, the property was clearly thriving as a bed and breakfast. Inside, they found a cozy reception area with period furnishings and the unmistakable charm of a well-loved historic building. A woman in her 30s greeted them from behind an antique desk. Welcome to Rosemont Inn. Are you checking in today? James hesitated, unsure how to explain their presence. Emma stepped forward smoothly. Actually, we're doing some family research. I believe this property was once called Thornfield Hall. The woman's friendly expression dimmed slightly. Yes, that was its original name, though it hasn't been called that in decades. Are you historians? I'm a history teacher, Emma offered. And my father is, she glanced at James, recently connected to the property's history. Before the woman could respond, an elderly man emerged from a back room, his gait slow but purposeful. Tall and distinguished with a full head of white hair, he studied the newcomers with sharp blue eyes. I thought I recognized that voice, he said, focusing on James. You look just like him, you know, Charles. Something about the eyes and the way you stand. James blinked in surprise. You knew Charles Everett? The old man nodded slowly. Robert Sullivan. I was just a boy when Mr. Everett used to visit here. My mother worked for him at Everett Hall. He peered at James more closely. You must be the heir he always said would come someday. This is my father, James Marshall, Emma explained. And I'm Emma. We recently inherited Everett Hall. Sullivan's face broke into a wide smile. Well, it's about time. Nearly 80 years we've been waiting for you to claim both properties. The receptionist looked between them in confusion. Grandfather, what are you talking about? This man owns Rosemont, Abigail, Sullivan said matter-of-factly. Has since 1943, though the trust has been operating it as an inn since my father convinced them to save it from demolition in 1969. James felt the ground shifting beneath him for the second time in a month. I own this property too? Sullivan nodded. Technically, yes. It's all in the trust documents. Thornfield Hall and Everett Hall, to be inherited together by Charles's chosen heir. He chuckled at their shocked expressions. Though I expect that lawyer Harrington didn't mention it, did he? Always was a stickler for following Charles's instructions to the letter. Abigail looked faint. Grandfather, we can't just give the inn to these people. This is our livelihood, our home. Sullivan patted her hand reassuringly. Now, Abigail, no one's giving anything away. The Sullivans have been caretakers for both properties for generations. I expect Mr. Marshall here has just as much interest in preserving this place as we do. He turned to James. Isn't that right? James nodded slowly, mind still processing this new development. I have no intention of disrupting your lives or the business. I'm just trying to understand what Charles expected of me. Of us. He gestured to include Emma. Sullivan's eyes twinkled. I expect he wanted you to find what he couldn't. Come, let me show you something. He led them through the inn to a small, private library at the back of the house. Unlike the public spaces updated for guests, this room remained frozen in time. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. This was General Thornfield's private study, Sullivan explained, and later, when Charles owned the property, he spent countless hours in here, searching. Searching for the Confederate collection, Emma said, earning a sharp look from Sullivan. So you know about that, do you? Charles must have left his letter for you. James nodded. We found it today, along with these. He showed Sullivan the two keys. The old man examined them with reverence. The study key and the vault key. Charles always believed they were the path to redemption. Vault? James asked. Sullivan gestured around the room. Thornfield was said to have built a hidden vault somewhere on the property to conceal the collection during the war. Charles spent years looking for it, convinced that at least some portion of the treasure remained hidden here. And did he ever find it? Emma asked eagerly. Sullivan shook his head. Not to my knowledge. My father said Charles became obsessed, tearing up floorboards, knocking on walls, even bringing in early metal detectors after the war. Eventually, he seemed to give up. James frowned, studying the room with a craftsman's eye. The woodwork was exceptional, intricate moldings, perfectly proportioned wainscoting, and built-in bookshelves that must have taken months to create. The place where time stands still but never stops moving, he murmured, remembering the clue from Charles's letter. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. What's that? Just something from the letter, James replied, moving toward the fireplace. The mantel was an impressive piece of stonework, carved with oak leaves and acorns. Above it hung a portrait of a stern-faced man in a Confederate uniform, presumably General Thornfield himself. As James examined the fireplace, something about the stonework caught his professional attention. The proportions seemed slightly off, the mantel a few inches deeper than it needed to be, the hearth extending just a bit too far into the room. This fireplace, he said slowly, it's been modified at some point. Sullivan nodded. Several times over the years. It had a gas insert for a while in the 1950s, then we restored it to wood burning in the renovation. James knelt to examine the hearthstones more closely. One stone near the center seemed different from the others, a slightly different color, with an almost imperceptible seam around its edges. Emma, hand me that fireplace poker, he requested, pointing to the brass set of tools beside the hearth. Using the poker as a lever, James carefully pressed against the edge of the unusual stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft grinding sound, the stone shifted, revealing a small cavity beneath. Sullivan gasped. In all these years, no one ever noticed that. Inside the cavity was a small iron box, its surface etched with an elaborate design of intertwined vines. A keyhole was visible on the front. The study key, Emma breathed, handing the smaller key to her father. The key fit perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. Inside the box was a folded piece of parchment and a larger, more ornate key. The vault key, Sullivan whispered, his voice filled with awe. James carefully unfolded the parchment to reveal an intricate diagram, what appeared to be architectural plans for a hidden room, with notations in faded ink. At the bottom was written, where the general always kept time with the enemy. Emma studied the diagram over his shoulder. It looks like instructions for accessing a hidden space. But where, Jim? Where the general always kept time with the enemy. What does that mean? Sullivan's eyes widened. The tower room. General Thornfield was said to spend hours in the tower watching for Union patrols with his telescope. Keeping time with the enemy, they called it. The tower room was on the third floor, accessed by a narrow spiral staircase. Used for storage now, it contained trunks of old linens and off-season decorations. A large arched window offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside, the perfect vantage point for a paranoid Confederate general. James examined the room carefully, comparing it to the diagram in his hands. According to this, there should be a mechanism somewhere near the window seat. The window seat was a built-in bench beneath the arched window, its hinged top revealing nothing but empty storage space beneath. But as James ran his hands along the carved paneling beside it, he felt a small depression, a circle no larger than a quarter, hidden within the pattern of the woodwork. I think I found something, he murmured, pressing the spot firmly. A soft click echoed in the quiet room, and a section of paneling beside the window swung inward, revealing a dark space beyond. Sullivan made the sign of the cross. Sweet Mother of Mercy, it was here all along. James retrieved a flashlight from his pocket and shined it into the opening. A narrow passage led to what appeared to be a small room. The vault key in his hand suddenly felt heavier, laden with history and expectation. "Should we go in?" he asked, looking at Emma and Sullivan. Emma nodded eagerly, but Sullivan held up a hand. "Perhaps just the heir should enter first. That's what Charles would have wanted, I think." James hesitated, then nodded. "I'll go. You two wait here." The passage was tight, forcing James to turn sideways to navigate it. It extended about 6 feet before opening into a small chamber, no larger than a walk-in closet. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see a massive iron door set into the far wall, clearly the vault mentioned in Charles's letter. The key slid into the lock smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. The mechanism turned with surprising ease, and the heavy door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. What lay beyond took James's breath away. The vault was larger than the antechamber, perhaps 12 feet square, with shelves lining 3 walls. And on those shelves sat history itself, rows of leather-bound documents, wooden boxes, canvas bags, and glass display cases containing what appeared to be military insignia, medals, and personal effects. In the center of the room stood a small table, and on it, a single wooden chest reinforced with iron bands. The chest was unlocked, its lid slightly ajar. James approached it slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Inside, gold coins gleamed in the flashlight's beam, hundreds of them, stamped with dates from the 1850s and early 1860s. A small leather notebook rested atop the coins, and James carefully opened it to find a handwritten inventory in faded ink. "Confederate Treasury Deposit, April 2nd, 1865, the first page read. "Entrusted to J. Everett for safekeeping by order of General R. Thornfield." The pages that followed detailed the contents: gold coins, bonds, personal jewelry donated to the Confederate cause, and historical documents including signed letters from Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. At the back of the notebook was a more recent edition, dated 1943 and written in what James recognized as Charles Everett's handwriting. "To my heir, you have found what I could not bring myself to face, the evidence of our family's greatest shame and the opportunity for our redemption. The contents of this vault represent not just monetary value, but the stolen history of many Southern families. I leave it to you to right this wrong, to return what can be returned, and to ensure that this history is preserved, not hidden. The gold in this chest is your inheritance. Blood money, yes, but cleansed by your commitment to justice. Use it wisely." James stood in the vault for a long moment, surrounded by the weight of history and responsibility. Charles had left him more than property and wealth. He had left him a moral obligation, a chance to redeem a family legacy tarnished by betrayal and theft. "Dad?" Emma's voice called from the passage. "Are you okay in there, Er?" "I'm fine," he called back, his voice echoing in the small space. "You should come see this, both of you." As Emma and Sullivan joined him in the vault, their expressions mirrored his own amazement. Sullivan moved through the space with reverence, gently touching document boxes and artifacts as if greeting old friends. "All these years," he murmured, "the rumors were true after all." Emma examined the inventory with her historian's eye. "This is incredible. Documents signed by Confederate leaders, family heirlooms, military records. This could be one of the most significant Civil War collections ever discovered." James nodded, thinking of Charles's instructions. "And now we have to decide what to do with it all." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "Isn't it clear? We need to preserve these artifacts, make them available to historians and researchers, and return what can be identified to the descendants of the original owners," James added, remembering Charles's wishes. This wasn't just Confederate property. It was personal items entrusted to Jonathan Everett by desperate families. Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Charles would be pleased to hear you say that. He carried the guilt of his father's betrayal his whole life." James looked around the vault, at history preserved by secrecy and revealed by perseverance. "We'll need experts, museums, genealogists, people who can help identify these items and find their rightful owners. The University of Virginia has one of the best Civil War research centers in the country, Emma suggested. They could help coordinate authentication and preservation. Sullivan smiled, watching them with satisfaction. I think Charles chose his heir well. He wanted someone who would understand that value isn't just in gold coins, it's in doing what's right, even after 80 years. James picked up one of the gold coins, feeling its weight in his palm. Each one was worth thousands in today's market, and there were hundreds in the chest. Even after returning the identifiable items, the remaining gold would be worth millions. We should document everything before we move it, he said, the carpenter in him approaching the task methodically. Photographs, detailed inventory, proper storage containers. Emma was already taking pictures with her phone, her historian's training kicking in. This is going to take weeks, maybe months, to properly catalog. We have time, James said, realizing it was true. For the first time in years, he wasn't facing financial pressure or looming deadlines. Charles had provided not just wealth, but the freedom to do this right. As they carefully examined the vault's contents, James thought about the strange journey that had brought them here, from the brink of foreclosure to the discovery of a hidden Confederate treasure. Charles Everett had orchestrated it all from beyond the grave, testing his heir's character before entrusting him with both tremendous wealth and tremendous responsibility. The true Everett legacy, James realized, wasn't the gold or the properties. It was the chance to right an old wrong, to bring hidden history into the light, and to ensure that justice, even long-delayed justice, was finally served. Emma looked up from an ornate sword she was examining, her eyes bright with excitement. Dad, do you realize what this means? This discovery will rewrite portions of Civil War history. These documents could provide insights into the final days of the Confederacy that historians have only speculated about. James nodded, already thinking about the logistics of preserving and protecting their find. And we're going to make sure it's handled right. No rushing, no cutting corners. These artifacts have waited 80 years. They deserve proper care now. Sullivan watched them with a satisfied smile. Charles would be proud. This is exactly what he hoped for, that his heir would understand the true value of his legacy. As the afternoon light faded from the tower windows, James thought about Charles Everett, the lonely man who had carried his family's shame for decades, who had tried and failed to right his father's wrong, and who had ultimately placed his hope for redemption in the hands of a descendant he would never meet. We won't let you down, Charles, James murmured, looking around at the vault that had kept its secrets for so long. Your legacy is safe with us. And somewhere, perhaps, Charles Everett was finally at peace. The news of the discovery spread quickly, though James insisted on keeping the full details private until they could properly document and authenticate everything. The University of Virginia's Historical Preservation Department responded with remarkable speed, sending a team of experts led by Dr. Eleanor Webb, a specialist in Civil War artifacts with a reputation for meticulous research and unwavering ethics. This could be one of the most significant Civil War discoveries of the century, Dr. Webb declared as she surveyed the vault's contents. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore white cotton gloves as she gently examined a leather-bound journal with the Confederate seal embossed on its cover. These documents appear to be official communications from the final weeks of the Davis administration. James watched the experts work, feeling both pride and unease. The pride came from fulfilling Charles's wish to bring this history to light. The unease stemmed from the growing realization of just how valuable and controversial their discovery might be. Some of these items clearly belong in a museum, Emma said, photographing a set of military medals. But others were personal possessions entrusted to Jonathan Everett for safekeeping. We need to try to find the descendants of the original owners. Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. That's an admirable approach, Miss Marshall. Many collectors would simply auction everything off to the highest bidder. That's not what Charles wanted, James said firmly, and it's not what we want either. The cataloging process was painstaking. Each item had to be photographed, described, and researched. Dr. Webb brought in additional specialists, a numismatist for the coins, a documents expert for the letters and journals, a military historian for the weapons and insignia. The team worked for 12 hours a day, setting up a temporary conservation lab in Thornfield Hall's dining room. By the end of the first week, they had compiled a preliminary inventory that took James's breath away. Over 300 gold coins dating from 1840 to 1863, personal correspondence from Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders, military maps with handwritten notations, family jewelry donated to the Confederate Treasury, and historical documents including what appeared to be an early draft of the Confederate Constitution with margin notes. The total value is difficult to estimate, Dr. Webb told James and Emma during an evening debriefing. The gold alone is worth approximately $4 million at current market rates, but the historical artifacts, she shook her head in wonder, are literally priceless. The kind of items major museums would build entire exhibitions around. James nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility growing heavier by the day. And what about identifying the original owners? Dr. Webb pulled out a leather-bound ledger. We've been cross-referencing this inventory book with historical records. So far, we've identified 28 families who contributed items to what General Thornfield called the preservation collection. Many of these families still have descendants living in Virginia and throughout the South. We should contact them, Emma said immediately. Let them know what we found. Dr. Webb exchanged glances with her colleagues. That is complicated, Ms. Marshall. Legally speaking, all of this belongs to you and your father now. The statute of limitations on any ownership claims expired decades ago. But morally speaking, James asked quietly. The historian's expression softened. Morally speaking, your instinct to return family heirlooms is commendable, but it needs to be handled carefully, with proper documentation and perhaps legal oversight. That night, as James sat on the veranda of Everett Hall, watching fireflies dance across the darkening lawn, he contemplated the strange twist his life had taken. Just a month ago, he'd been facing financial ruin. Now he was the custodian of a historical treasure that could reshape understanding of the Civil War's final days and potentially bring closure to families who had lost pieces of their heritage over a century and a half ago. Emma joined him, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. Penny for your thoughts? Just thinking about Charles, James replied, accepting the drink. Why he went to all this trouble to set up this inheritance. Why he cared so much about making things right. He was carrying his father's sins, Emma said thoughtfully. Imagine discovering that your family's wealth and position were built on betrayal. It must have haunted him. James nodded, thinking of the portrait of Charles in the study, the sadness behind his eyes now making perfect sense. And now it's our responsibility to finish what he started. Are you having second thoughts? Emma asked, studying your father's face in the gathering darkness. Not about doing the right thing, James assured her. Just wondering how to go about it. This isn't just about returning a few family heirlooms anymore. This is major historical stuff. Museums will be involved, universities, maybe even the government. Emma was quiet for a moment. We need a plan, a clear approach that honors Charles's wishes while preserving the historical significance of what we found. And we need to protect ourselves, James added. Once word gets out about the full extent of this discovery, there will be people trying to claim pieces of it, legitimately or otherwise. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted their conversation. Headlights cut through the twilight as a car pulled up to Everett Hall. James tensed, not expecting visitors, especially after dark. A moment later, Richard Harrington emerged from his luxury sedan, looking as impeccable as always despite the late hour. His expression, however, was anything but composed. Mr. Marshall, he called as he approached the veranda. I believe we need to talk. James stood, instinctively moving slightly in front of Emma. Mr. Harrington, this is a surprise. I've just come from Thornfield Hall, the lawyer said, his voice tight with controlled anger, where I discovered a team of university researchers examining what appears to be a significant historical collection. A collection you failed to inform me about. I wasn't aware I needed to report my findings to you, James replied evenly. Charles's letter said the legacy was mine to discover and address as I saw fit. May I? Harrington gestured to one of the wicker chairs on the veranda. When James nodded, he sat down, straightening the crease in his trousers with practiced precision. Mr. Marshall, while the Everett estate is indeed yours now, there are complications you may not be aware of. What kind of complications? Emma asked, her tone wary. Harrington fixed her with a steady gaze. Legal complications, historical complications, and most pressingly, security complications. You've discovered a collection worth millions, possibly tens of millions, And you've brought in a team of academics with no concept of the dangers involved. Dr. Webb and her team are highly respected professionals, Emma defended. I'm sure they are, Harrington conceded, but they're not equipped to handle what comes next. Once news of this discovery becomes public, and it will, despite whatever assurances of confidentiality you might have, there will be claims and counterclaims, media attention, security concerns, and legal challenges. James frowned. What legal challenges? You just said everything belongs to us now. Possession, yes. But provenance is a different matter. Harrington leaned forward. The items in that vault were acquired under questionable circumstances during wartime. Some might argue they were essentially stolen from the Confederate government, which would make them technically property of the United States government now. That's absurd, Emma protested. The Confederacy wasn't a legitimate government, and Jonathan Everett wasn't a government agent. He was a private citizen who betrayed a trust. A clever lawyer could argue otherwise, Harrington countered. And then there are the families of the original owners. While they may have no legal claim after all this time, the court of public opinion is another matter entirely. James studied the lawyer's face, trying to discern his true concerns. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Harrington? That you allow our firm to handle the public disclosure and disposition of the collection. We have experience with historically sensitive matters, connections with the appropriate authorities, and the legal expertise to protect your interests. Our interests, James repeated, or the firm's interests, or perhaps someone else's interests entirely. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Harrington's face. You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for, Mr. Marshall. I'm a contractor, James replied. I've dealt with enough lawyers and developers to recognize when someone's trying to control a valuable asset. Harrington's smile was thin. Fair enough. Let me be more direct then. The Everett legacy is complicated, with implications beyond just the historical artifacts you've found. Charles Everett made provisions for the disposition of certain items in the collection, provisions that are legally binding on his heir. What provisions? Emma demanded. Why weren't these mentioned before? Because they only become relevant once the collection was discovered, Harrington explained. Charles was explicit about this. The heir had to find the legacy on their own merit, demonstrating both the character and the capability to handle what came next. James felt his patience wearing thin. And now that we found it, there are more hoops to jump through? More tests of our worthiness? Not tests, Harrington corrected. Guidelines, specifically regarding 23 items in the collection that Charles identified as having particular historical or cultural significance. These items are to be donated to specific institutions, museums, universities, historical societies, as determined by a committee established in the trust. And let me guess, Emma said sarcastically, your firm controls this committee. Harrington had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We have representation, yes, along with historians, ethicists, and legal scholars specializing in cultural artifacts. James exchanged glances with his daughter, seeing his own skepticism mirrored in her expression. Why are we just hearing about this now? Because Charles was explicit that these provisions only be revealed after the heir discovered the collection independently, Harrington repeated. He wanted to ensure that the primary motivation was moral responsibility, not financial gain or prestige. So what happens now? James asked. Now we convene the committee, Harrington said. Review the inventory your experts have compiled, identify the 23 designated items, and determine the appropriate recipients according to Charles's wishes. And the rest of the collection, Emma asked. Remains yours to dispose of as you see fit, Harrington confirmed, though I would strongly advise, following Charles's suggestion, to return family heirlooms to descendants where possible. James stood and walked to the veranda railing, looking out over the property that had so suddenly become his. The moonlight silvered the ancient oaks, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. In just a few weeks, his life had transformed from struggling contractor to wealthy landowner and custodian of history. The changes were almost too much to process. We need time to consider this, he said finally, turning back to Harrington, and we'll want to review any documents related to this committee and its authority. Of course, Harrington reached into his briefcase and produced a folder. These are copies of the relevant trust provisions. Take whatever time you need to review them. But I would caution against delaying too long. Once word of the discovery spreads, and it will, things will become much more complicated. After Harrington departed, James and Emma spent hours poring over the documents. The provisions were indeed as the lawyer had described. Charles had identified 23 specific items from the preservation collection to be donated to public institutions, with a committee determining the most appropriate recipients based on historical significance and public access. It seems legitimate, Emma conceded reluctantly. And honestly, it makes sense. Some of these artifacts belong in museums where they can be studied and appreciated. I agree, James said. I just don't like feeling manipulated. First, we weren't told about Thornfield Hall. Now there's this committee with authority over part of the collection. What else is Harrington keeping from us? Emma yawned, the late hour finally catching up with her. We can worry about that tomorrow. For now, let's just be glad we found the collection at all. That's what Charles wanted, right? For his heir to discover the legacy and make it right. The next morning brought new complications. James awoke to find 3 news vans parked at the entrance to Everett Hall, reporters setting up cameras on the public road beyond the property line. His phone showed 17 missed calls, mostly from numbers he didn't recognize. What the hell, he muttered, pulling on jeans and a t-shirt before heading downstairs. Emma was already in the kitchen, her laptop open on the island counter, her expression grim. Someone leaked the story, she said without preamble. Look, the screen shows a local news website with the headline, Major Civil War Treasure Discovered at Historic Virginia Estate. The article beneath was light on specifics but mentioned a collection of Confederate artifacts worth millions, and gold coins hidden for over 150 years. How did they find out? James demanded. Dr. Webb promised discretion. It wasn't her, Emma said, scrolling through the article. The source is listed as a person familiar with the historical preservation community. My guess is one of the specialists she brought in couldn't resist sharing the big news. James glanced out the window at the gathering media presence. Great, just what we needed. His phone rang again, this time showing Dr. Webb's number. Dr. Webb, he answered, I assume you've seen the news? Mr. Marshall, I am absolutely mortified. The historian's voice was tight with anger. I've already identified the likely source, a graduate student who was assisting with document preservation. He's been removed from the project, but the damage is done. What do we do now? James asked, running a hand through his hair in frustration. We need to get ahead of this, Dr. Webb advised. Issue a brief statement confirming the discovery, but emphasizing that evaluation is ongoing and no decisions about disposition have been made. Otherwise, speculation will run wild. James agreed to meet her at Thornfield Hall within the hour to coordinate their response. As he and Emma drove the now familiar route between the 2 properties, they passed more news vans headed in the opposite direction. They're going to find Thornfield too, Emma predicted grimly. It won't take much investigative work to connect the properties. She was right. By the time they arrived, 2 television crews were already setting up near the Rosemont Inn sign, while bewildered guests watched from the porch. Inside, they found Dr. Webb in heated conversation with Abigail Sullivan, whose face was flushed with anger. We have bookings through the summer, Abigail was saying. I can't have reporters accosting my guests or trespassing on the property. I understand your frustration, Dr. Webb replied, her academic calm clearly tested. But this is now a matter of significant public interest. The best we can do is manage the situation. James cleared his throat, drawing their attention. Ladies, I think we need a unified approach here. Over the next hour, they hammered out a strategy. James would make a brief statement to the press, confirming the discovery of historically significant artifacts, but providing no specifics about gold or valuables. Dr. Webb would handle academic inquiries, emphasizing the historical importance rather than monetary value. Abigail would continue running the inn as usual, with additional security hired to keep reporters off the property. Just as they finished their planning, James's phone rang again. Richard Harrington, his voice unusually urgent. Mr. Marshall, I've just been contacted by the Virginia State Historical Society and the Museum of the Confederacy. Both are asserting potential claims on items in the collection. Already? James asked in disbelief. The news only broke this morning. These institutions have resources dedicated to monitoring such developments, Harrington explained, and they move quickly when significant artifacts are involved. I strongly advise convening the committee immediately to establish our official process before more claims start rolling in. James pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache forming. Fine, set it up, but I want Emma and Dr. Webb included. Dr. Webb wasn't part of Charles's provisions, Harrington objected. I don't care, James said firmly. She's our expert advisor, and I trust her judgment. She's part of this now. After a moment's hesitation, Harrington agreed. Very well, I'll arrange for the committee to meet tomorrow at our Richmond offices. And Mr. Marshall, I strongly advise against making any public statements about specific artifacts until after that meeting. James hung up and relayed the conversation to the others. Dr. Webb looked thoughtful. The committee approach might actually be beneficial, she mused. It provides a structured process for evaluating claims and making decisions. Without it, you'd be facing a free-for-all of competing interests. I still don't like how Harrington keeps revealing new aspects of the inheritance, Emma said. It feels like he's controlling the situation to serve some agenda we're not seeing. Maybe, James conceded. Or maybe Charles really did structure things this way deliberately, revealing each piece only when we were ready for it. Outside, the media presence was growing. James could see more news vans arriving, and now a police cruiser had pulled up, presumably to manage the situation. I should make that statement, he sighed, before this gets completely out of hand. Standing on the steps of Thornfield Hall, facing a cluster of microphones and cameras, James felt distinctly out of place. He was a contractor, used to working with his hands, not a public figure managing a historical discovery. But for Charles and for Emma, he would do his best. Good morning, he began, voice steadier than he felt. My name is James Marshall. My daughter Emma and I recently inherited 2 historic properties from a distant relative, Charles Everett. During our exploration of these properties, we discovered a collection of Civil War-era artifacts that had been preserved for historical purposes. The reporters shouted questions simultaneously, creating an unintelligible din. James held up his hands. Please, I'll continue with a brief statement, then take a few questions. The crowd quieted marginally. These artifacts appear to be items that were entrusted to my ancestor during the final days of the Civil War. They include documents, personal effects, and other historically significant items. We are working with experts from the University of Virginia to properly catalog and preserve everything. Our intention is to ensure these artifacts are handled responsibly, with respect for their historical significance, and in accordance with my relative's wishes. What about the Confederate gold? A reporter shouted. Is it true you found millions in gold coins? James maintained his composure. We've discovered various items of historical interest. A complete inventory is still being compiled, and it would be premature to discuss specifics. Do you plan to sell the collection? Another called out. Our primary concern is proper historical preservation, James replied. Some items may be appropriate for museums, while others may rightfully belong to descendants of the original owners. We're establishing a formal process to make these determinations ethically and transparently. The questions continued for several minutes, growing increasingly specific and insistent. James deflected as best he could, sticking to generalities while emphasizing the historical rather than monetary significance of their find. Finally, with the press still shouting questions, he ended the impromptu conference. Thank you for your interest. We'll provide updates as the process continues. Back inside, Emma gave him an approving nod. Well handled, Dad. You didn't give away anything substantive, but you didn't seem evasive either. It won't satisfy them for long, Dr. Webb warned, especially once word leaks about the gold. Treasure has a way of capturing the public imagination in ways that historical documents simply don't. She was right. By evening, more specific details had somehow reached the media. The local evening news led with Confederate gold found in secret vault, while national outlets were beginning to pick up the story, framing it as a modern-day treasure hunt with a redemption narrative. James's phone rang constantly. Reporters, historians, representatives from various museums, and even a few people claiming to be descendants of General Thornfield or families mentioned in the collection's inventory. This is getting out of hand, he told Emma as they drove back to Everett Hall that evening. We need to lay low until the committee meets tomorrow. But when they arrived home, they found an unexpected visitor waiting on the veranda. a tall, distinguished black man in his 60s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit and leaning on a carved walking stick. "Mr. Marshall," he called as James parked the truck. "DeMarcus Washington, I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." James approached cautiously, wary of another reporter or claimant. "How did you get past the gate?" Dr. Washington smiled slightly. "Mrs. Sullivan vouched for me. We've known each other for many years. I'm a professor emeritus of American history at Howard University, specializing in African American experiences during the Civil War and Reconstruction." Emma's eyes widened in recognition. "Dr. Washington, I've read your books. Your work on black soldiers in the Union Army was groundbreaking." The professor inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Your mother mentioned you're a history teacher yourself." "Mrs. Sullivan told you about us?" James asked, still uncertain. "Indeed, we served together on the Virginia Historical Preservation Society." Dr. Washington's expression grew more serious. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of Charles Everett's letter and what it might mean for my family." James exchanged glances with Emma. "You'd better come inside, Dr. Washington." Over coffee in Everett Hall's kitchen, James still couldn't bring himself to use the formal dining room. Dr. Washington explained his interest. "My great-great-grandfather was Samuel Washington, an enslaved man owned by the Thornfield family. According to family history, he helped hide the Thornfield valuables in the final days of the war under promise that he and his family would be granted freedom and a parcel of land once the conflict ended." "But Thornfield died at Appomattox," Emma said, connecting the dots. "Precisely," Dr. Washington nodded. "And Jonathan Everett, who knew of this promise, chose not to honor it. My ancestor remained enslaved until Union forces arrived, and the promised land never materialized." James frowned. "I'm sorry for what your family experienced, Dr. Washington, but I'm not sure how this relates to the collection we found." "Among the items entrusted to Everett," Dr. Washington continued, "was reportedly a signed document from General Thornfield, officially granting Samuel Washington and his family their freedom, along with deed to 20 acres of Thornfield land. This document was never executed because of Thornfield's death and Everett's betrayal. My family has been searching for proof of this agreement for generations." Emma leaned forward, historian's interest piqued. "And you think this document might be in the collection we discovered?" "I believe it's possible," Dr. Washington replied. "When I heard about your discovery on the news today, I immediately thought of our family's story. If such a document exists, it would not only validate our oral history, but might have legal implications regarding a portion of the Thornfield property." James felt a new weight settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about returning heirlooms or donating artifacts to museums anymore. This was about a family denied their freedom and rightful property because of his ancestors' actions. "Dr. Washington, we're still cataloging everything," he said carefully. "But I promise you, if such a document exists in the collection, you will be the first to know." The professor studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Marshall. That's all I can ask at this point." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "Please contact me if you find anything relevant to my family's history." After Dr. Washington departed, James sat heavily at the kitchen table. "This just keeps getting more complicated." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "But isn't this exactly what Charles wanted? For us to right the wrongs of the past? Dr. Washington's story is part of that legacy too." "You're right," James agreed. "But how many more stories like his are out there? How many more families affected by Jonathan Everett's betrayal?" "I don't know," Emma admitted, "but I think we have to try to address as many as we can. It's what Charles would have wanted." That night, James couldn't sleep. He paced the opulent master bedroom that still didn't feel like his, thinking about Charles Everett, Dr. Washington, and the tangled web of history and responsibility he'd inherited. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and made his way to Charles's study. Something about the room's atmosphere, the leather-bound books, the antique desk, the portrait of Charles above the fireplace, helped James feel connected to the man who had set all this in motion. He settled into the desk chair, running his hands over the smooth oak surface, appreciating the craftsmanship as only a fellow woodworker could. Almost absently, he began opening drawers, not really searching for anything specific, just trying to understand Charles better through the objects he'd kept close. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of ledgers, James found a small leather journal he hadn't noticed during their earlier searches. Unlike the formal business records, this appeared to be personal. The leather worn from handling, the pages filled with hurried handwriting. Opening it carefully, James realized he was looking at Charles Everett's private diary from 1942-43, the final year of his life. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder in the man's private thoughts. But his curiosity won out. The entries started routinely enough: notes about business matters, property maintenance, observations about the war in Europe. But as James continued reading, a pattern emerged. Charles made frequent references to MW and meetings that seemed to occur in secret. Met with MW again today, one entry from March 1943 read. She continues to press her family's claim, and I cannot deny the justice of it. If only I had found the document among father's papers. Without it, I have only my word against generations of denial. James frowned, turning pages, finding more references to this mysterious MW. Then, in an entry from September 1943, just a month before Charles's death, MW brought her grandson today, Marcus, a brilliant boy with wise eyes. Only 5 years old, yet he carries himself with remarkable dignity. When I looked at him, I saw the future, a future where perhaps the scales might finally be balanced. I have made my decision. Harrington objects strenuously, but my will is set. The trust will wait for the right heir, and when the collection is found, the Washington family will finally receive justice. James sat back stunned. Marcus Washington. The professor who had visited them earlier that day must be the same brilliant boy with wise eyes that Charles had met in 1943, and MW, Marcus's grandmother, had been pressing a claim that Charles believed was just. This changed everything. Charles hadn't established the elaborate inheritance scheme just to return Confederate artifacts to their rightful owners. He had been trying, in his own complex way, to address a specific injustice done to the Washington family. With growing excitement, James continued reading, hoping for more specific information about the document Dr. Washington had mentioned. But the remaining entries were frustratingly vague, focusing on Charles's declining health and his arrangements with Harrington for the trust. The final entry, dated October 12, 1943, just 3 days before his death, simply read, "It is done. May my heir prove worthy of the task, and may the Everett name finally be redeemed through justice rather than wealth." James closed the journal, mind racing. Had Harrington known about Charles's specific interest in the Washington family claim? If so, why hadn't he mentioned it? And was the freedom document Dr. Washington sought really part of the collection they discovered? Tomorrow's committee meeting suddenly took on new significance. James needed to ensure that any document related to the Washington family was identified and properly addressed, regardless of whatever agenda Harrington and his committee might have. With renewed purpose, James finally felt ready for sleep. Charles's wishes were becoming clearer, and James was determined to fulfill them, no matter how complicated the path might become. The committee meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Harrington Wells, in Stone's Richmond office, an imposing colonial revival building in the heart of the financial district. James and Emma arrived 30 minutes early, accompanied by Dr. Webb, whose expertise they'd come to rely on over the past week. The firm's conference room exuded old money and power, mahogany paneling, oil paintings of stern-faced founding partners, and windows overlooking the James River. 6 people were already seated around the massive table when Harrington ushered them in. "Allow me to introduce the committee members," Harrington said with practiced formality. Dr. Helen Blackwood, Curator Emeritus of the Virginia Historical Society; Judge William Thornton, retired from the Fourth Circuit Court; Professor Alan Michaels, ethicist from Georgetown University; Ms. Diane Fulton, representing the Museum of the Confederacy; Mr. Edward Stone, senior partner in our firm; and Mr. Calvin Pierce, financial executor of the Everett Trust. James shook hands with each, noting the varying degrees of warmth in their greetings. Dr. Blackwood and Professor Michaels seemed genuinely pleased to meet him, while Pierce and Stone maintained cool professional distance. "And these are?" Stone asked, eyeing Dr. Webb with obvious disapproval. "James and Emma Marshall, the beneficiaries of Charles Everett's trust," Harrington explained, "and their advisor, Dr. Eleanor Webb from the University of Virginia." "I was not informed that outside parties would be attending," Pierce said. his voice carrying the refined accent of old Virginia aristocracy. Tall and lean, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he looked like central casting's idea of a Southern gentleman. Mr. Marshall insisted on Dr. Webb's presence, Harrington replied, and as the heir, he has certain privileges. Pierce's mouth tightened, but he offered no further objection. Once everyone was seated, Harrington opened a leather portfolio. As you all know, we're here to implement the provisions of Charles Everett's trust regarding 23 specific artifacts from the recently discovered collection. The trust directs that these items be distributed to appropriate public institutions where they can be properly preserved and displayed for educational purposes. Before we begin, James interrupted, I'd like to add something to the agenda. All eyes turned to him. I discovered Charles Everett's personal diary last night, and it contains information that may be relevant to our discussions. Harrington's expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked. What sort of information? James described his findings regarding the Washington family's claim, careful to present just the facts without interpretation. As he spoke, he watched the committee members' reactions, particularly Pearson Stone, whose frowns deepened with every word. This is the first I've heard of any specific claim by the Washington family, Dr. Blackwood said when James finished. Though it's well documented that many enslavers made promises of freedom or land that went unfulfilled after the war. If such a document exists, Judge Thornton added, it could have significant historical value, but any legal claim based on it would be complex, to say the least. The document may not even exist, Pierce interjected. Charles's diary mentions his search for it, not its discovery. True, James acknowledged, but given that Charles specifically mentioned the Washington family in connection with his plans for the collection, I believe we should prioritize looking for this document as we review the artifacts. Professor Michaels nodded thoughtfully. From an ethical standpoint, addressing historical injustices should be a consideration in our deliberations. If Charles intended part of his legacy to involve making amends to this family, we should honor that intention. Our mandate is clear, Stone countered, tapping the trust document in front of him. We are to identify the 23 items Charles designated for public institutions. Personal claims, however compelling, are outside our purview. Actually, Dr. Webb spoke up, earning a frosty glare from Stone. If we're following the spirit of Charles's intentions, we should consider that he established this committee after meeting with Marcus Washington's grandmother. The timing suggests he saw institutional donations in addressing the Washington claim as complementary goals, not competing ones. Stone began to object, but Harrington raised a hand to quiet him. Let's proceed methodically. First, we should review the preliminary inventory to identify the designated items. Then we can discuss specific claims or concerns. For the next 2 hours, they went through the catalog Dr. Webb's team had compiled. The 23 items Charles had designated for public donation included military maps showing Confederate troop movements, letters from Jefferson Davis discussing surrender options, a draft of the Confederate Constitution with handwritten notes, and various weapons and insignia of historical significance. Notably absent from this list was any mention of the gold coins or personal items like family jewelry or heirlooms. Those, it seemed, Charles had intended to remain with his heir or be returned to descendants of the original owners. These institutional donations are straightforward, Judge Thornton said, after they'd identified all 23 items. The more complex question is how to handle the remainder of the collection. That's not for this committee to decide, Pierce said firmly. The non-designated items belong to Mr. Marshall, to dispose of as he sees fit. Within the parameters established by the trust, Harrington added, which encourages, though does not require, the return of personal items to descendants where possible. James leaned forward. I intend to honor that encouragement, and I'd like to start with investigating the Washington family's claim. A noble sentiment, Pierce said, his tone suggesting otherwise. But without the specific document mentioned in Charles's diary, what exactly would you be returning to them? If there's no document, Emma interjected, then perhaps a portion of the gold. After all, their ancestor was promised land and freedom, both of which have monetary value that was never delivered. Pierce's eyebrows shot up. You're suggesting giving away part of your inheritance based on an unverified verbal claim from over 150 years ago? I'm suggesting we follow Charles's wishes, James replied evenly. If he believed the Washington family had a legitimate claim, then I do too. Dr. Blackwood cleared her throat. Perhaps there's a middle approach. The collection includes numerous documents we haven't yet thoroughly examined. I propose we complete the cataloging process with special attention to anything that might relate to the Washington family or other unfulfilled promises to formerly enslaved people. This compromise seemed acceptable to most, though Stone and Pierce exchanged glances that suggested their reservations. Very well, Harrington concluded. The committee will reconvene once the cataloging is complete to finalize the institutional donations. In the meantime, Mr. Marshall is free to continue researching potential family claims, with the understanding that no irreversible decisions should be made until our work is completed. As they gathered their materials to leave, Diane Fulton from the Museum of the Confederacy approached James. Mr. Marshall, I'd like to offer the museum's resources to help identify descendants of the families mentioned in the collection. We maintain extensive genealogical records that might be useful. That's very kind, James replied, surprised by the offer. Not entirely altruistic, she admitted with a small smile. We're hoping some of the non-designated items might eventually find their way to our institution through donation. But regardless, it seems like the right thing to do. James accepted her card, appreciating the honesty. As they prepared to depart, Pierce approached, his manner considerably less friendly. Mr. Marshall, he said quietly, a word of advice from someone who has managed the Everett Trust for over 30 years. Proceed carefully with these family claims. Once you open that door, you may find more claimants than you can possibly satisfy. The gold you've discovered would be quickly depleted, leaving nothing for the legacy Charles wanted you to establish. What legacy is that? James asked. Because from his diary, it seems the Washington family was specifically part of his plan. Pierce's expression hardened. Charles was an idealist in his final years, troubled by guilt that wasn't his to bear. Jonathan Everett's actions during the war may have been questionable by modern standards, but they built a fortune that has benefited many through charitable works over generations. That's the true Everett legacy. Before James could respond, Emma appeared at his side. Ready to go, Dad? Pierce nodded curtly and moved away, leaving James with an uneasy feeling. The man clearly had his own vision of the Everett legacy, one that might not align with Charles's intentions or James's emerging understanding of his responsibility. Outside, as they walked to the car, Dr. Webb voiced what James was thinking. Pierce seems remarkably invested in how you handle your inheritance. As financial executor, he probably gets a percentage of the trust's value, Emma suggested. Perhaps, Dr. Webb said thoughtfully, but I suspect there's more to it than money. The way he emphasized the true Everett legacy, it was almost personal. James nodded, recalling Pierce's defensive tone. Let's see what we can find out about him when we get back. And let's accelerate the cataloging process. I want to know if that Washington document exists before our next committee meeting. The drive back to Charlottesville was tense, with all three lost in their own thoughts. As they passed rolling farmland and vineyards, James found himself reflecting on how quickly his life had changed. Not just financially, but morally. He'd inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. Not just property, but purpose. When they arrived at Thornfield Hall, they found Robert Sullivan waiting for them on the porch, his weathered face grave. Someone broke into the vault last night, he announced without preamble. What? James felt his stomach drop. How? It was sealed and under security watch. Professional job, Sullivan said grimly. Disabled the alarm system, knew exactly where to go and what they were after. They rushed to the tower room where police technicians were dusting for fingerprints around the hidden entrance. The vault door stood open, and inside James could see immediately that several items were missing. The gold chest, he said, scanning the shelves. It's gone. A police detective approached, introducing herself as Lieutenant Garcia. Mr. Marshall, we'd like to ask you some questions about what was taken. Over the next hour, James provided details about the missing items, primarily the chest of gold coins, which constituted the bulk of the collection's monetary value, along with several document folders that had yet to be fully cataloged. Any idea who might have known about the gold? Lieutenant Garcia asked. Too many people, James admitted. The news has been all over the media for days, and we've had dozens of researchers and experts examining the collection. All vetted by the university, Dr. Webb added defensively. Nevertheless, the detective continued, this appears to be a targeted theft by someone with specific knowledge. They didn't take larger artifacts or items that would be difficult to transport or sell, just the gold and selected documents. The documents, Emma said suddenly. Which ones specifically? They consulted Dr. Webb's inventory. 3 folders were missing, all containing papers from the final weeks of the Civil War, including communications between General Thornfield and various Confederate officials. Why take those? James wondered aloud. The gold I understand, but those documents would be nearly impossible to sell without raising red flags in the historical community. Unless selling them wasn't the point, Emma suggested. What if they contained information someone wanted to suppress? Lieutenant Garcia raised an eyebrow. Such as? We don't know exactly, James admitted. But we recently learned there might be a document granting freedom and land to an enslaved family. A promise that was never fulfilled after the war. The detective made a note. I'll need a complete list of everyone who had access to information about the collection, especially anyone who knew about this potential freedom document. As they compiled the list, James couldn't shake a growing suspicion. The timing was too convenient, immediately after the committee meeting where he'd raised the Washington family's claim. And the items taken, the gold that might have been used for restitution, and potentially the very documents that could prove the claim, suggested someone with a vested interest in preventing that outcome. When the police finally departed, promising increased patrols and a thorough investigation, James, Emma, and Dr. Webb gathered in Thornfield's kitchen to assess their situation. This changes everything, Doctor, Webb said, accepting the coffee Abigail Sullivan silently offered. Without the gold, the monetary value of the collection is significantly reduced. It's not about the money, James replied. It's about what the theft represents. Someone is trying to prevent us from fulfilling Charles's wishes. But who? Emma asked. And why? The gold was legally yours, Dad. Even if you decided to give some of it to the Washington family or other claimants, that was your choice to make. Unless someone had a different vision for the Everett legacy, James said slowly, remembering Pierce's words. Someone who's been managing the trust for decades and might have their own ideas about how things should go. You think Pierce is behind this? Dr. Webb looked skeptical. I don't know, James admitted, but he was awfully concerned about how I might use the gold, and he seemed particularly dismissive of the Washington family's claim. Emma frowned. That's not much to go on, Dad. Pierce might just be a stuffy old trustee who thinks he knows best. You're right, James conceded. We need more information before making accusations. What we do know is that someone wanted that gold in those specific documents badly enough to commit a sophisticated theft, and likely knew exactly what they were looking for, Dr. Webb added, which suggests inside knowledge of the collection. They were interrupted by the arrival of Robert Sullivan, who'd been speaking with the security company. The system was compromised professionally, he reported. Cameras looped, motion sensors disabled. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Any sign of forced entry? James asked. Sullivan shook his head. That's the strangest part. They either had a key or knew the security codes. The implications hung heavily in the air. Only a few people had that level of access. The research team, the Sullivans, and James and Emma themselves. What about Harrington? Emma suggested. As trustee, would he have access codes or keys? Possibly, Sullivan acknowledged. The firm has maintained oversight of both properties for decades. James rubbed his tired eyes. So our suspect list includes the committee members, the research team, the Harrington firm, and possibly others we don't even know about yet. Not very helpful. Perhaps we're approaching this wrong, Dr. Webb suggested. Instead of focusing on who took the items, let's consider what else might be in those stolen document folders. If the Washington family's freedom paper was among them, what other sensitive information might be there? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Good thinking. Let's check the preliminary catalog and see what those folders were supposed to contain. They spent the next hour reviewing Dr. Webb's notes and photographs. The stolen folders had been only partially cataloged, but they contained correspondence from the final weeks of the war, communications between General Thornfield and various Confederate officials, as well as personal letters to and from Jonathan Everett. Here's something interesting, Emma said, zooming in on a photograph of one document. This letter mentions arrangements for secure transport of Treasury assets. It's dated April 1st, 1865, just days before Richmond fell. Dr. Webb leaned closer, and it's addressed to Jonathan Everett from someone named Colonel William Pierce. Pierce? James and Emma exchanged glances. Could be a coincidence, Dr. Webb cautioned. Pierce isn't an uncommon name in Virginia. Still worth looking into, James said. Any relation between our committee member Calvin Pierce and a Colonel William Pierce from the Civil War era would be awfully suspicious. Emma was already typing on her laptop. Let me see what I can find about the Pierce family genealogy. While she researched, James called Lieutenant Garcia to share their suspicions about the Pierce connection and the possible contents of the stolen documents. The detective promised to look into it, but warned that without more concrete evidence, they couldn't focus their investigation on Pierce alone. As evening approached, exhaustion set in. They'd been going non-stop since the committee meeting that morning, with the shock of the theft adding to their stress. Dr. Webb departed for her campus office, promising to check university records for any information about the Pierce family's historical connection to the Everetts or Thornfields. James and Emma returned to Everett Hall, both lost in their own thoughts. The grand house felt less welcoming now, shadowed by uncertainty and the growing sense that they were caught in a complex web of historical grievances and modern ambitions. What do we do now? Emma asked as they sat in the kitchen, neither having the energy to prepare a proper meal. We keep going, James said simply. We continue cataloging what remains of the collection. We pursue the Washington family's claim, with or without the specific document, and we try to figure out who's trying to stop us and why. Emma nodded, but her expression remained troubled. I've been thinking, Dad, what if there's more to Charles's plan than we understand? What if the diary entries we found were just part of the story? What do you mean? Well, he went to elaborate lengths to set up this inheritance, the age requirement, the character assessment, the staged revelations through Harrington. That suggests he was playing a very long game. Maybe there are more pieces we haven't discovered yet. James considered this. Like what? I don't know exactly. But if I were hiding historically significant artifacts and planning for their eventual discovery decades later, I might build in some safeguards, backups in case things didn't go according to plan. You think Charles might have created copies of important documents or hidden additional clues? Emma shrugged. It's just a theory, but given how carefully he orchestrated everything else, it seems possible. James nodded slowly, the idea taking root. We should go through his personal spaces again. His study here, his bedroom, anywhere he might have left additional messages for his heir. They spent the next 2 hours searching Charles's study more thoroughly than before, checking for hidden compartments, examining books for annotations, even testing the walls for hollow spaces. Their efforts yielded nothing new. Discouraged but not defeated, they moved to Charles's bedroom, a space they'd explored only cursorily during their initial investigation of the house. The room had been preserved much as Charles had left it, with period furniture, heavy curtains, and a massive four-poster bed. What exactly are we looking for? James asked, surveying the space. Anything personal, Emma replied. Something that might give us insight into Charles's thinking beyond what we found in the diary. They worked methodically, checking drawers, examining the backs of pictures, even looking under the mattress. James found himself admiring Charles's taste in craftsmanship. Every piece of furniture was exquisitely made, built to last generations. As he ran his hands along the intricate carvings of the bed frame, appreciating the skill involved, his fingers caught on something unusual, a small irregularity in the wood where the headboard met the post. Pressing gently, he felt a mechanism give way, and a narrow drawer slid out from the seemingly solid wood. Emma, he called softly, look at this. Inside the hidden drawer was a small leather case containing a pocket watch and a folded piece of paper. The watch was gold, ornately engraved with the initials R.T., Robert Thornfield. The paper proved to be a letter, dated October 1st, 1943, just 2 weeks before Charles's death. To my heir, James read aloud, his voice hushed. If you have found this hiding place, you have demonstrated the attention to detail and appreciation for craftsmanship that I hoped for. What follows is for you alone, not for lawyers or committees or historians. Emma moved closer, peering over his shoulder at the faded handwriting. The collection you have discovered at Thornfield Hall is significant but incomplete. In my final years, as I realized I might never live to see justice done, I separated certain critical items for safekeeping. The most important of these, the document granting freedom and land to Samuel Washington and his family, I have placed where it cannot be destroyed or suppressed by those who would deny the truth. James and Emma exchanged excited glances before he continued reading. The document is hidden within Everett Hall itself, in the one place that represents both our family's shame and the possibility of redemption. When you find it, you will also find instructions for accessing funds I have set aside specifically for making amends to the Washington family and others harmed by my father's betrayal. This separate account is unknown to the trust administrators and beyond their control. The pocket watch belonged to General Thornfield and was given to my father along with the collection. It contains an inscription that may guide you. May you succeed where I failed, and may the circle of betrayal finally be broken. The letter was signed simply, Charles Everett. James carefully opened the pocket watch. Inside the cover was an inscription. Time reveals all truths. Look to where the past and future meet at the hour of betrayal. A riddle, Emma whispered. Another test. James turned the watch over in his hands, noting its weight and craftsmanship. The hour of betrayal. When would that be? April 1865, Emma suggested, when Thornfield entrusted the collection to Jonathan Everett. And where do the past and future meet? James wondered, closing the watch carefully. They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the cryptic message. Then Emma snapped her fingers. The grandfather clock. Remember the clue that led us to the second key? The place where time stands still but never stops moving. But we already checked the clock, James reminded her. That's where we found the key to the vault. We checked inside the case, Emma corrected. But what about the clock itself? The mechanism, the face? She was already on her feet, excitement energizing her tired body. Let's go to look again. The grandfather clock stood in the main hallway of Everett Hall, its steady ticking a constant presence in the house. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, its case was richly carved oak, the clock face ornate brass with Roman numerals. James examined it with renewed attention, focusing on details he might have missed before. The hour of betrayal. What time would that be? Emma studied the face. If we're talking about April 1865, maybe it refers to a specific time when Jonathan Everett decided to betray the trust. Or, James said slowly, maybe it's simpler than that. What's the numerical hour on the clock that would represent betrayal? Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, Emma offered. So maybe 3 and 10? 3:10? James shook his head. I think we're overthinking this. In the context of a clock, what number would represent betrayal most directly? They both stared at the clock face for a moment before Emma gasped. Two-faced, like being deceptive or disloyal. The number 2. James nodded, excitement building. Let's try it. He carefully opened the glass covering the clock face and gently moved the hour hand to 2 o'clock. Nothing happened. Maybe it needs to be exactly 2, Emma suggested. Line up the minute hand as well. James adjusted both hands to precisely 2 o'clock. Still nothing. This can't be it, he sighed, frustrated. We're missing something. Emma frowned, thinking. The inscription said where the past and future meet at the hour of betrayal. The hands at 2 o'clock doesn't involve any meeting point. Wait, James said, studying the clock face more carefully. Look at the design around the numerals. There's a subtle pattern in the brass, almost like a hidden compartment or button near the number 2. Emma leaned closer. You're right. The decorative scrollwork is different there. James pressed gently on the area near the Roman numeral 2. With a soft click, a small section of the brass face swung open, revealing a tiny compartment behind it. Inside was a folded document, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. With trembling fingers, James extracted it. The document was handwritten on official-looking paper, dated April 2nd, 1865, and signed at the bottom by Robert Thornfield. The heading read, Deed of Manumission and Land Grant. This is it, Emma whispered. the Washington family's freedom paper. James carefully unfolded it, reading the formal 19th century language that granted Samuel Washington and all his descendants both freedom and 20 acres of land on the eastern boundary of Thornfield Plantation, including the spring and cabin thereupon. It's legally executed, James noted. Thornfield's signature is witnessed by two other officers. This would have been binding if it had been properly filed. But Jonathan Everett kept it hidden instead, Emma finished, denying the Washington family their freedom and land. Tucked inside the freedom paper was another note from Charles, briefer than the previous one. The Washington family's restitution fund is held at First Virginia Bank, account number 78433921, accessible with the code word redemption. Use it wisely, and may our family's debt finally be paid. James carefully refolded the documents, a profound sense of responsibility settling over him. We need to contact Dr. Washington immediately. It's after midnight, Emma pointed out. Tomorrow then, James conceded. First thing. As they secured their discoverers in Charles's study safe, James couldn't help but wonder about the timing. The theft of the gold and documents had initially seemed like a devastating setback, but it had led them to search more thoroughly, ultimately finding what Charles had protected most carefully, the key to fulfilling his deepest wish for redemption. Do you think Charles anticipated something like the theft? Emma asked, echoing his thoughts. Is that why he separated the most important document from the rest of the collection? I think he understood human nature, James replied. He knew there would be people who would try to preserve the status quo, who would resist acknowledging historical injustices if it threatened their position or wealth. People like Calvin Pierce, Emma suggested. If he is related to the Colonel Pierce mentioned in that letter, then he might have a personal stake in suppressing evidence of his ancestors' involvement in the Confederate Treasury's disappearance. James finished. We need to find out more about that connection. As they finally prepared for bed, exhausted but exhilarated by their discovery, James found himself thinking about Charles Everett in a new light. The man hadn't just left him wealth and property, he'd crafted an intricate puzzle spanning decades, designed to ensure that justice would eventually prevail, even if powerful interests opposed it. Charles was clever, he told Emma as they parted in the hallway. He built in redundancies, backup plans. He didn't just hope his heir would do the right thing. He made sure the right thing was the only viable path. Emma smiled tiredly. Like father, like daughter, I'd have done the same. So would I, James realized. Maybe that's why Harrington chose us. Maybe that's what Charles meant by suitable character. Not just honesty or integrity, but the determination to see justice done, no matter the obstacles. As he settled into bed, James felt a growing connection to Charles Everett, not just as his benefactor, but as a kindred spirit across time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, contacting Dr. Washington, investigating the Pierce connection, dealing with the theft investigation. But for the first time since discovering the collection, James felt confident they were on the right path. Charles had led them to the Washington family's freedom paper, not just as a historical artifact, but as a living document whose promise could finally be fulfilled after more than 150 years. The true Everett legacy wasn't the mansion or the gold or even the historical collection. It was the opportunity to right an ancient wrong, to close a circle of injustice that had remained open for generations. With that realization came purpose and clarity. Whatever happened next, James knew exactly what he needed to do, Dr. Marcus Washington arrived at Everett Hall precisely at 9 the next morning, his dignified bearing unchanged despite the urgency of James's call. Only a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his anticipation as James led him into the study. "You've found something," Dr. Washington said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes." James carefully removed the freedom document from the wall safe, handling it with the reverence it deserved. "I believe this belongs to your family." Dr. Washington's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the yellowed paper. For several minutes he said nothing, eyes moving slowly across the formal 19th century script that granted his great-great-grandfather freedom and land. When he finally looked up, his composure had slipped, revealing raw emotion. "My grandmother spoke of this document her entire life," he said quietly. "Everyone thought it was just a family legend. something to give us pride during difficult times. Even I had my doubts, though I never admitted them. He carefully refolded the paper. Where was it hidden? James explained their discovery in the grandfather clock, including Charles's separate letter and the bank account established for restitution. So Charles Everett knew of its existence but couldn't find it during his lifetime, Dr. Washington mused. Instead, he created a trust and set aside funds specifically for my family. It appears so, James confirmed, and he hid the document where even the trust administrators couldn't find or destroy it. Smart man, Dr. Washington nodded appreciatively. He understood institutional resistance to historical justice. Emma, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. The bank account should still exist. We haven't had time to check yet, but Charles's instructions were specific. I'm less concerned with financial restitution than with historical vindication, Dr. Washington said, though his tone suggested both mattered. This document proves what my family has claimed for generations, that we were promised freedom and land that was then denied through deliberate deception. There's something else you should know, James said, sharing their discovery about the potential connection between Calvin Pierce and a Confederate officer mentioned in the stolen documents. We have reason to believe Pierce may be behind the theft of the gold and certain papers from the collection. To protect his family's reputation, Dr. Washington suggested, nodding thoughtfully. Unfortunately common among descendants of those implicated in historical injustices. We're still investigating, James cautioned, but given Pierce's position on the committee and his resistance to your family's claim, it seems suspicious. More than suspicious, Dr. Washington agreed. If true, it suggests a conspiracy spanning generations, the Pierce and Everett families entwined in both the original betrayal and subsequent cover-up. Emma's phone chimed with an incoming message. She checked it, eyes widening. It's from Dr. Webb. She found something in the university archives about the Pierce family. She quickly scanned the message. William Pierce wasn't just any Confederate officer. He was Jonathan Everett's son-in-law, married to his daughter, Catherine. So Calvin Pierce is directly descended from both families, James said, the pieces falling into place. Which means, Dr. Washington added, that he has a double stake in suppressing this history, protecting both sides of his family tree from historical judgment. James paced the study, thinking through the implications. Pierce has been financial executor of the Everett Trust for 30 years. He would have had ample opportunity to search for the Freedom document himself. But Charles hid it too well, Emma concluded. So when we discovered the collection and started asking questions about the Washington family claim, Pierce panicked. Washington carefully placed the Freedom document on Charles's desk. What happens now? Legally, we need to authenticate the document, James said. Though I have no doubt it's genuine, once verified, we'll approach the authorities about the theft and Pierce's likely involvement. And the land grant? Dr. Washington asked. The 20 acres promised to my ancestor? James spread his hands. That's more complicated. The land would have been part of the original Thornfield plantation. We'd need historical surveys to determine its exact location, which is now most likely part of either Thornfield Hall or neighboring properties, Dr. Washington surmised. Ownership transferred multiple times over the decades. We'll figure it out, James promised. Between the historical record, this document, and whatever funds Charles set aside, we'll find a way to make this right. I believe you will, Dr. Washington said, studying James with approval. Charles chose his heir well. After Dr. Washington departed with certified copies of the document, the original would be professionally preserved. James and Emma headed to First Virginia Bank in downtown Charlottesville. The bank's trust department initially seemed skeptical about an account potentially established in 1943, but the account number and code word redemption eventually led them to a secured file. The account was indeed established by Charles Everett in September 1943, the trust officer explained, reviewing the paperwork. Initially funded with $50,000, which was a substantial sum at the time. And its current value, James asked. The officer made some calculations on his computer. With compounding interest over 80 years, approximately $4.7 million. James and Emma exchanged shocked glances. Charles had created a parallel legacy independent of the main Everett Trust, one specifically dedicated to restitution. The account terms are unusual, the officer continued. It can only be accessed by Charles Everett's heir upon presentation of a specific document, a deed of manumission and land grant from 1865, which we have, James confirmed, producing the certified copy they'd prepared for the bank. After several hours of verification procedures and paperwork, James was officially recognized as the account's controller. Rather than making any immediate withdrawals, he added Dr. Washington as a co-signer, ensuring the funds would be used exactly as Charles had intended, for restitution to the Washington family and potentially others harmed by Jonathan Everett's betrayal. As they left the bank, James's phone rang. Lieutenant Garcia from the county police. "Mr. Marshall, we found fingerprints at the scene that don't match any of the authorized personnel, and we've identified the vehicle used in the theft, a black SUV with dealer plates that was reported stolen 2 days ago." "Any leads on who was driving it?" James asked. "Security cameras at a gas station 5 miles from Thornfield Hall captured images of a man filling up the vehicle around 2 a.m. the night of the theft. The image is grainy, but we're enhancing it now." "Keep me posted," James requested. "And Lieutenant, you might want to look into Calvin Pierce's whereabouts that night." There was a pause on the line. "The trust executor? You have evidence of his involvement?" "Circumstantial at this point," James admitted. "But we've discovered family connections that give him motive to suppress certain documents in the collection." "I'll look into it," Garcia promised, "but tread carefully with accusations against prominent citizens, Mr. Marshall." James understood the warning. Pierce was well connected in Virginia society, his family name opening doors and commanding respect. Accusing him of theft without solid evidence would be risky. By the time they returned to Everett Hall, it was mid-afternoon. The media presence had grown, with several news vans now permanently stationed near the property entrance. National outlets had picked up the story of the Confederate treasure and subsequent theft, with speculation running wild about the collection's true value and historical significance. James had been dodging interview requests, but Emma suggested a different approach. What if we controlled the narrative, held a proper press conference, shared the true story, including the Washington family's claim and Charles's efforts at restitution? Go public with everything? James considered the idea. Pierce wouldn't expect that. Exactly. If he stole those documents to suppress historical truth, the worst thing we could do is broadcast that truth to the world. After discussing the strategy with Dr. Washington, who enthusiastically supported it, they scheduled a press conference for the following morning. Dr. Webb agreed to participate, lending academic credibility to their presentation, while Dr. Washington would speak to his family's long struggle for recognition and justice. That evening, as James reviewed his planned remarks, a call came from Harrington. "Mr. Marshall, I understand you're planning a press conference tomorrow." "News travels fast," James observed. "In certain circles, yes." Harrington's tone was carefully neutral. "May I ask what you intend to disclose?" "The truth, Mr. Harrington, the complete truth about the Everett legacy, including Jonathan's betrayal of the Washington family and Charles's efforts to make amends." A long silence followed. "Have you considered the potential legal implications?" "The committee has not yet finalized its recommendations regarding the collection." "The committee's work pertains to the 23 designated items for institutional donation," James reminded him. "What I've discovered about the Washington family is separate from that process." "Nevertheless," Harrington persisted, "such public disclosures could complicate ongoing negotiations with museums and historical societies." "I'm not particularly concerned with what's convenient for the institutions," James replied firmly. "Charles wanted the truth revealed and justice done. That's what I intend to accomplish." Another pause. "Mr. Pierce has expressed serious reservations about this approach." "I'm sure he has," James said dryly, "given that he's likely behind the theft of evidence that would implicate his ancestors in historical wrongdoing." Harrington's sharp intake of breath was audible. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Marshall, which I'll be sharing with the police, not the press, at least not yet. The press conference will focus on the positive aspects: historical reconciliation, long-delayed justice, and Charles's vision for redemption." "I see." Harrington sounded resigned. "Then I suppose I should be there to represent the trust's interests." "You're welcome to attend," James assured him. "This isn't about assigning blame to the current trustees, just about acknowledging historical truth and moving forward constructively." After ending the call, James wondered about Harrington's true position in all this. The lawyer had been scrupulously correct in his handling of the inheritance, revealing each aspect exactly as Charles had specified. Yet his loyalty seemed divided between Charles's wishes and the trust's institutional interests that Pierce had likely influenced for decades. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect Virginia spring day. James stood on the steps of Everett Hall, facing a larger media contingent than he had anticipated. News organizations from across the country had sent representatives, and even some international outlets were present. Beside him stood Emma, Dr. Washington, and Harrington, the latter looking uncomfortable but composed. James had never been comfortable with public speaking, but his years managing construction crews had taught him to project authority when needed. He stepped to the microphones, notes in hand, but rarely consulting them. Good morning. My name is James Marshall. A month ago, I was a contractor facing foreclosure on my family home. Today, I stand before you as the heir to the Everett estate and the custodian of a historical legacy that spans generations. He outlined the inheritance, the discovery of the collection, and its historical significance, emphasizing the educational and cultural value over the monetary aspects. Then he introduced Dr. Washington. The Everett legacy isn't just about historical artifacts, the professor explained with quiet dignity. It's about historical justice. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Washington, was promised freedom and land by Confederate General Robert Thornfield in the final days of the Civil War. When Thornfield died at Appomattox, that promise was betrayed by Jonathan Everett, who concealed the legal document granting that freedom. A murmur ran through the assembled press as Dr. Washington held up a preserved copy of the Freedom Paper. This document, hidden for over 150 years, was recently discovered by Mr. Marshall. It vindicates what my family has claimed for generations, that we were denied our rightful freedom and property through deliberate deception. Questions erupted, which James fielded systematically. Yes, they had reported the theft of gold and documents to the police. No, he couldn't comment on specific suspects. Yes, the freedom document appeared authentic based on preliminary analysis by university experts. When asked about his plans for the remaining collection, James announced that the historically significant items would be donated to appropriate institutions, while personal artifacts would be returned to descendants of the original owners where possible. And what about the Washington family? A reporter called out. Will they receive compensation for the land they were denied? Absolutely, James confirmed. Charles Everett established a separate fund specifically for restitution to the Washington family and others harmed by his father's actions. That fund, now valued at approximately $4.7 million, will be used to fulfill the promises made over 150 years ago. This revelation caused another stir. James noticed Harrington's surprise. Clearly, the lawyer had been unaware of this separate account outside the main trust. As the press conference continued, a commotion at the back of the crowd caught James's attention. Lieutenant Garcia was approaching with two uniformed officers, moving purposefully toward the steps. Behind them, looking thunderous, came Calvin Pierce. James continued answering questions, watching from the corner of his eye as Garcia spoke briefly with Emma at the edge of the gathering. Emma's eyes widened, and she quickly made her way to James's side, whispering in his ear, "They've arrested Pierce for the theft. Security footage confirmed it was him at the gas station, and they found the stolen documents in his home office, though not the gold." James nodded slightly, maintaining his composure as he addressed the next question. Pierce, seeing that his presence had been noticed, abruptly turned and began walking rapidly back toward the parking area, the two officers following closely. "One moment," James said into the microphone. "Lieutenant Garcia, is there something you'd like to share with the press regarding recent developments in the theft investigation?" Garcia, caught off guard by the direct address, hesitated briefly before stepping forward. Professional discretion warred with the opportunity for publicity, but given that Pierce had been spotted by dozens of reporters, discretion lost. "The county police have made an arrest in connection with the theft from Thornfield Hall," she announced. "I can confirm that Calvin Pierce is assisting with our inquiries after evidence linking him to the crime was discovered during a lawfully executed search of his residence." The press erupted again, cameras swinging to capture Pierce being escorted to a police cruiser. James seized the moment to conclude the conference. "As you can see, this story continues to evolve. The Everett legacy has been shaped by choices, some honorable, others less so, across generations. My commitment, and that of my daughter Emma, is to ensure that the final chapter of this legacy is one of truth, reconciliation, and justice. As the reporters dispersed, many racing to file their stories about Pierce's arrest, Harrington approached James with a troubled expression. "This is most irregular, Mr. Marshall. Mr. Pierce has been a respected trustee for decades, and apparently a thief willing to suppress historical evidence to protect his family's reputation." James replied evenly. "The trust will need a new financial executor, Mr. Harrington." The lawyer nodded reluctantly. "I'll convene the partners to address the situation. In the meantime, I must say your handling of the Washington family matter is not what I expected." "But it's exactly what Charles wanted," James pointed out. "He left very clear instructions, both in his diary and in the documents we found with the Freedom Paper." "Yes, well," Harrington straightened his already immaculate tie. "I suppose I've underestimated both Charles's foresight and your determination. The firm will, of course, support your efforts at historical reconciliation." After Harrington departed, Dr. Washington clasped James's hand warmly. "You've done more in a month than my family could accomplish in generations. Charles Everett would be proud." "I'm just fulfilling his vision," James said modestly. "He did the hard part, carrying the guilt, setting up the trust, making sure the truth would eventually come to light." "Nevertheless," Dr. Washington insisted, "it took courage to pursue this so publicly, especially with powerful interests opposed." The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. Pierce was formally charged with theft, breaking and entering, and evidence tampering. The stolen documents were recovered and returned to the collection, though the gold remained missing, presumably hidden somewhere only Pierce knew. The committee reconvened without Pierce, moving forward with the donation of the 23 designated items to museums and universities. With Harrington now more cooperative, whether from genuine support or concern for his firm's reputation remained unclear, the process went smoothly. Dr. Washington worked with historians and legal experts to determine the exact location of the 20 acres promised to his ancestor. Modern survey methods and historical records eventually identified the land as part of what was now the eastern section of the Thornfield Hall property, including a natural spring and the site where a cabin had once stood. Rather than pursuing a complex legal claim to the physical land, which now included guest cottages for the Rosemont Inn, Dr. Washington proposed an elegant solution: the creation of a historical education center on the site, funded by Charles's restitution account, where the story of Samuel Washington and the broader history of promises made and broken during Reconstruction could be taught. James readily agreed, and together they developed plans for the Washington Legacy Center, a state-of-the-art facility that would include exhibition space, research archives, and educational programs focused on post-Civil War history and reconciliation. Abigail Sullivan, initially concerned about the impact on her inn, quickly recognized the potential benefits of having a prestigious historical center associated with her property. She collaborated enthusiastically on planning how the two enterprises could complement each other, with Rosemont guests receiving special access to the center and educational tourists enjoying discounted accommodation at the inn. As the Washington Center took shape, other developments unfolded. Historical societies across the South expressed interest in items from the collection connected to their local histories. Universities requested access for research purposes. The Museum of the Confederacy proposed a special exhibition on contested treasures, the ethics of Civil War artifacts. Through it all, James remained focused on Charles's core purpose: making amends for historical wrongs while preserving the educational value of the collection. Each decision, from artifact placement to educational programming, was guided by this dual commitment. 6 weeks after the press conference, as construction began on the Washington Legacy Center, Lieutenant Garcia called with unexpected news. "We've located the gold, Mr. Marshall." Pierce finally revealed its location as part of a plea agreement. "Where was it?" James asked, surprised that Pierce had cooperated. "A storage unit in Richmond, registered under a company name. All 322 coins accounted for, plus some Confederate currency we didn't even know was missing." "That's remarkable," James said, genuinely stunned. The gold's return would add millions back to the collection's value. "There's something else," Garcia continued. During his confession, Pierce admitted this wasn't the first time he'd taken items from the collection. What do you mean? According to Pierce, his father and grandfather, both previous financial executors of the trust, systematically removed valuable items over decades. Family jewelry, rare coins, even historical documents they feared might lead to claims against the estate. James felt a chill. So the collection we found was already diminished. Significantly, according to Pierce, he claims his family saw themselves as protecting the Everett legacy from claimants and fortune hunters. After the call, James shared the revelation with Emma and Dr. Washington. The Pierce family has been suppressing claims and stealing valuables for 3 generations, he concluded, all while serving as trusted executors of Charles's estate. Charles must have suspected something, Emma reasoned. That's why he created the separate restitution account and hid the freedom document where only his chosen heir could find it. And why he structured the inheritance to require specific character traits, Dr. Washington added. He needed someone who would recognize the injustice and have the integrity to address it, regardless of pressure from the trustees. The recovery of the gold presented new possibilities for the Washington Legacy Center and other restitution efforts. With both the $4.7 million fund and the gold coins, valued at approximately $4.2 million, James now had substantial resources to fulfill Charles's vision for redemption. After consultation with Dr. Washington and other historians, James established the Everett Reconciliation Foundation with a mission to identify and address historical injustices but connected to the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. The foundation would fund research, education, and direct restitution to descendants of those wronged during these turbulent periods in American history. The Washington family received the first formal grant, $2.3 million, representing the estimated current value of the 20 acres in compensation for 8 generations of lost opportunity. Dr. Washington directed that half the funds be used for educational scholarships for family members, with the remainder supporting the Legacy Center's ongoing operations. Other grants followed as researchers identified additional families mentioned in the collection's documents, people who had entrusted valuables to Jonathan Everett for safekeeping that were never returned. While few had documentation as clear as the Washington family's freedom paper, James took a generous approach, providing funding for educational and community development projects in areas where these families had historically lived. 4 months after discovering the Everett legacy, James stood on a hill overlooking both properties. Everett Hall to the west, Thornfield Hall to the east. The land between them, once divided by history and betrayal, was now being unified through truth and reconciliation. The Washington Legacy Center was taking shape near the spring where Samuel Washington's cabin had once stood. Its modern architecture, designed to complement rather than mimic the historical buildings nearby, symbolized a forward-looking approach to addressing historical wrongs. Emma joined him on the hillside, having just finished a meeting with the center's educational director. She had discovered a passion for historical education through this process and was considering pursuing a doctorate herself, inspired by Dr. Washington's example. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "Charles," James replied, wondering if he could have imagined how all this would unfold. "I think he'd be pleased," Emma said confidently. His heir found the collection, returned the freedom document to the Washington family, established the center and foundation, all while exposing the Pierce family's decades of theft and deception. James nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "There's something poetic about it, isn't there? 3 generations of Pierces stealing from the collection and suppressing claims. 3 generations of Washingtons preserving their oral history despite being dismissed as fantasy, and Charles caught in between, trying to set things right. And he succeeded," Emma pointed out. "Through you." "Through us," James corrected, putting an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." The sun was setting behind Everett Hall, casting long shadows across the rolling Virginia landscape. From this vantage point, James could see the workers finishing for the day at the Legacy Center site, the guests enjoying cocktails on Thornfield Hall's veranda, and a tour group exploring the formal gardens of Everett Hall, which were now open to the public 3 days a week. In just 4 months, these properties had transformed from private residences to centers for historical education and reconciliation. The collection, once hidden in a forgotten vault, was now being properly preserved, studied, and shared with the world. And the Washington family, after 158 years of being denied their rightful freedom and land, was finally receiving recognition and restitution. "Do you ever miss our old life?" Emma asked suddenly. "The house, your contracting business, the simplicity of it all?" James considered the question seriously. Sometimes, there was a certain clarity to waking up each day knowing exactly what needed to be done, even if I was struggling financially. And now there's a different kind of clarity, he said, the kind that comes from purpose rather than necessity. Charles didn't just leave us wealth and property, he left us a mission. Completing that mission is more satisfying than any construction project I ever worked on. Emma nodded, understanding. It's like you've found a new calling. We both have. As they walked back toward Everett Hall, where they still chose to live despite owning two grand estates, James reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. From the brink of foreclosure to custodians of history and agents of reconciliation, a transformation neither could have imagined just months ago. Yet somehow it felt right. As if all James's practical skills, his integrity, his attention to detail, had been preparation for this role Charles had envisioned for his heir. Even his carpentry background had proved essential. Without it, he might never have found the hidden compartments containing Charles's most crucial messages. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times as they entered Everett Hall. James smiled at the sound, no longer just marking time, but reminding him of discoveries made and secrets revealed. The legacy Charles had protected for so long was finally fulfilling its purpose, not just preserving history, but healing its wounds and building a more just future. And for James Marshall, former contractor and reluctant heir, that was a foundation worth building. 1 year later, the autumn leaves drifted lazily across the grounds of what the locals now called the Everett, Washington Historical Complex. Vibrant reds and golds carpeted the rolling lawns between Everett Hall and Thornfield Hall, creating a natural pathway between the two properties that had once stood divided by secrets and betrayal. James Marshall stood on the veranda of the Washington Legacy Center, watching visitors move between the various buildings that now comprise the complex. Some headed toward Thornfield Hall's exhibition spaces, where the authenticated Confederate collection was displayed with detailed historical context. Others gathered near Everett Hall for guided tours of the architecture and period rooms. A group of school children followed a docent toward the Interactive Education Center, where they would learn about Virginia's complex Civil War and Reconstruction history through age-appropriate exhibits. "Quite a change from a year ago," Dr. Marcus Washington observed, joining James at the railing. Now the center's executive director, he had embraced the role with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," James admitted, "from nearly losing my home to managing all this." "Charles chose well," Dr. Washington said, not for the first time, though I doubt even he could have envisioned how completely his wishes would be fulfilled. James nodded, thinking of all that had transpired since the recovery of the gold coins. The Everett Reconciliation Foundation was now fully operational, with a distinguished board of historians, ethicists, and community leaders overseeing its work. The foundation had already identified and contacted descendants of 17 families whose heirlooms or valuables had been among the Confederate collection, arranging for either the return of these items or appropriate compensation. "The symposium attendees will be arriving soon," Dr. Washington reminded him. "Your keynote is scheduled for 2 o'clock. "Don't remind me," James groaned. Public speaking remained his least favorite aspect of his new role, despite Emma's coaching and encouragement. The symposium, Reconciliation and Restitution, addressing historical injustice in modern America, had drawn scholars, activists, and policymakers from across the country. James's reluctant celebrity as the contractor-turned-heir who had chosen justice over wealth had made him a sought-after speaker at such events. As Dr. Washington departed to welcome the first arrivals, James's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Landed safely in Richmond. Picking up the guest of honor now. See you at 1:30. James smiled, anticipation building. The guest of honor was someone he'd been corresponding with for months but had yet to meet in person, a discovery that had added yet another layer to the already complex Everett legacy. His phone rang again, this time showing Lieutenant Garcia's number. "Mr. Marshall?" she greeted him when he answered. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Calvin Pierce's sentencing hearing has been scheduled for next Tuesday." Thanks for letting me know, James replied. Will you need me to be there? No necessity, though you're welcome to attend. With the plea deal in place, it should be straightforward. 3 to 5 years, most likely, given his age and health conditions. After they disconnected, James reflected on Pierce's downfall. The man had initially maintained his innocence despite the evidence, but faced with multiple charges and the discovery of other artifacts in his possession, items stolen from the collection years before, he had eventually accepted a plea agreement. The subsequent investigation had revealed a multi-generational conspiracy within the Pierce family to diminish the collection and suppress potential claims. James's phone rang yet again, Harrington this time. The lawyer had maintained a carefully professional relationship with James over the past year, though the revelation of his firm's failure to prevent the Pierce family's systematic theft had damaged its reputation. Mr. Marshall, good afternoon. I'm calling about the final documents for the Thornfield Hall transfer to the Preservation Trust. Are you still available to sign them tomorrow? Yes, 10 o'clock works for me, James confirmed. After much consideration, James had decided that Thornfield Hall should be placed in a permanent conservation trust, ensuring its preservation as a historical site and educational facility regardless of who owned Everett Hall in the future. The Washington Legacy Center would maintain operational control, with guaranteed funding from the Foundation's endowment. As for Everett Hall, James and Emma continued to live in the caretaker's cottage rather than the main house. The mansion itself was now partially open to the public, its ground floor restored to period accuracy while the upper floors housed research facilities and Foundation offices. Very good, Harrington replied. And has there been any further communication from Ms. Everett regarding her claim? We've been in regular contact, James said carefully. Emma's picking her up from the airport now. She'll be attending the symposium as our special guest. I see. Harrington's tone was neutral. Please extend my regards. After ending the call, James walked toward Everett Hall, nodding to visitors and staff along the way. Many greeted him by name, still somewhat starstruck by the man whose story had been featured in documentaries and news programs across the country. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, especially after Caroline Everett had come forward 6 months ago. Her emergence had been yet another twist in the already complex narrative of the Everett legacy. Caroline was Charles Everett's granddaughter through his previously unknown son, a child born to Charles's late-in-life second marriage in 1940, 3 years before his death. The boy, named Thomas, had been raised by his mother in California, far from Virginia in the complicated Everett history. Thomas had died young, but his daughter Caroline had inherited his curiosity about the father he'd barely known. Her research had eventually led her to news reports about James's inheritance and the discovery of the Confederate collection. After DNA confirmation of her relationship to Charles, Caroline had technically become another heir to the Everett estate. James had immediately offered to share the inheritance, but Caroline, a successful architect in her 60s, had been more interested in the historical aspects than the financial ones. She had declined any claim to Everett Hall or the monetary assets, asking only for personal items that might help her understand the grandfather she'd never known. Their correspondence over the past months had evolved from formal legal communications to friendly exchanges about Charles, his motivations, and his legacy. Carolyn had provided family photographs and stories passed down from her father and grandmother, adding personal dimension to the Charles Everett that James had come to know through diaries and letters. Today would be their first face-to-face meeting, a reunion of sorts between Charles's chosen heir and his biological descendant, bridging the gap between legacy and bloodline. Inside Everett Hall, preparations for the symposium reception were underway. The formal dining room, now restored to its 1940s appearance, had been set up with elegant refreshments for the visiting scholars and dignitaries. In the library, staff were arranging chairs for a planned panel discussion on the ethics of historical restitution. "Mr. Marshall," called Mrs. Sullivan, who had transitioned from caretaker to the complex's hospitality director. "The governor's office called. He'll be arriving at 3 rather than 2:30. "Thanks for letting me know," James replied. The governor's interest in the Everett, Washington project had been both political and personal. His own family had historic ties to the region, and the positive publicity surrounding the reconciliation efforts provided a welcome opportunity for a public figure to associate with historical justice. As James checked final arrangements, He reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a struggling contractor with calloused hands and mounting debts. Now he managed a multi-million-dollar historical complex and foundation, hobnobbed with governors and university presidents, and had been featured in a PBS documentary titled The Heir, Redeeming America's Past. Yet for all the external changes, James still saw himself as essentially the same, a practical man doing what needed to be done, just with different tools and on a larger scale. He still approached problems methodically, still valued craftsmanship and integrity, still put family first. Emma teased him for continuing to drive his old pickup truck despite their now considerable wealth, but some habits were worth keeping. Speaking of Emma, he spotted her car pulling into the private parking area behind Everett Hall. He headed over to meet them, curious and slightly nervous about finally meeting Caroline Everett in person. Emma emerged first, professional in a tailored blazer and slacks, her professor outfit, as James called it. She had indeed pursued her doctorate in American history, with a focus on the intersection of family histories and national narratives. At 24, she was younger than most of her fellow doctoral candidates, but her first-hand experience with the Everett legacy gave her insights few could match. From the passenger side emerged an elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair and familiar eyes, Charles Everett's eyes, as James had come to recognize them from photographs. Carolyn Everett stood straight-backed and observant, taking in Everett Hall with visible emotion. "Dad, this is Caroline," Emma said, making the introduction they had all been anticipating. "Caroline, my father, James Marshall." "It's an honor to finally meet you in person," James said, extending his hand. Carolyn ignored the hand and instead embraced him warmly. "The honor is mine. You've done more for my grandfather's legacy than I ever could have." Her voice carried the slight inflection of California rather than Virginia, but something in her directness reminded James of Charles's writing, the same clear-eyed assessment and lack of pretension. "I've just been following his plan," James demurred as they separated. "Charles laid the groundwork decades ago." "But you executed it perfectly," Caroline insisted. "I've read all the reports, seen the documentaries. You made choices that honored not just the letter of his intentions, but their spirit." As they walked toward Everett Hall, Caroline taking in every detail of the property, James felt a strange sense of completion. Charles's blood relative and chosen heir, united in fulfilling his vision for redemption. "I brought something for you," Caroline said, reaching into her handbag. She produced a small leather case containing a pocket watch. Not General Thornfield's watch that James had found, but one of similar vintage. This belonged to Charles. "My father left it to me, along with a few other personal items he had from his father. I thought you might like to have it, given how much pocket watches have featured in this story." James accepted the gift with genuine emotion. "Thank you. This means a great deal." Inside the case was an inscription. "To my son Thomas, may you find your own path to meaning. Your father, Charles." "He knew he was dying when my father was born," Carolyn explained. "This watch and a few letters were his attempt to reach across time and connect with the son he wouldn't live to see grow up. Rather like what he did with you, in a way." The parallel hadn't occurred to James before, but it made perfect sense. Charles, facing mortality, had created two legacies, one biological through his son Thomas, and one spiritual through the heir who would eventually fulfill his quest for justice. As they entered Everett Hall, Carolyn paused in the main hallway, her gaze drawn to the grandfather clock that had hidden the Washington family's freedom document. "So this is where it was all along," she mused. "Right at the heart of the house, hiding in plain sight." Charles was clever that way, James agreed. He understood that some truths need to be protected until the right moment for revelation. The afternoon unfolded with a flurry of activity. Symposium attendees arrived, distinguished professors, authors, museum curators, and representatives from historical societies across the country. The governor made his appearance, complete with press entourage, shaking hands and expressing appropriate admiration for the reconciliation efforts. James's keynote address, despite his discomfort with public speaking, was received with a standing ovation. He spoke not of his own role, but of Charles's vision and the Washington family's perseverance, of how historical injustice could be addressed meaningfully even across centuries. During the subsequent panel discussion, moderated by Dr. Washington, An unexpected question came from a young historian from Howard University. Mr. Marshall, given the success of the Everett, Washington Reconciliation Project, do you see this as a potential model for larger-scale restitution for historical injustices, like slavery and land theft? James considered carefully before answering. What we've done here is specific to one family's story and one historical wrong. It can't and shouldn't be seen as a template for all historical injustices, which require their own careful consideration and appropriate remedies. He paused, aware of the room's attention. That said, I believe our experience offers three principles that might be useful in other contexts. First, acknowledge the truth, however uncomfortable. Second, recognize that meaningful restitution must be shaped by those who experience the harm, not those whose ancestors caused it. And third, understand that reconciliation isn't a single act but an ongoing process that transforms both parties. Washington nodded approvingly. Well said, Mr. Marshall. The Washington Legacy Center embodies these principles, not as a final settlement of historical accounts, but as a living commitment to truth and healing. After the formal proceedings concluded, James, Emma, and Caroline joined Dr. Washington for a private dinner in the small dining room of Everett Hall. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from family stories about Charles to plans for the Legacy Center's future programs. I've been thinking, Carolyn said as they lingered over coffee, about establishing a scholarship in Charles and Thomas Everett's names for students studying historical reconciliation or related fields. That would be wonderful, Emma enthused. We could administer it through the foundation. I'd like that, Carolyn nodded. It feels right to connect the California branch of the Everett family with the Virginia legacy in a meaningful way. Dr. Washington raised his glass in a toast to connections across time and place, the visible and invisible threads that bind us to the past and to each other. As they clinked glasses, James felt a profound sense of rightness. The Everett legacy had expanded far beyond what he could have imagined that rainy night when Richard Harrington had first appeared on his porch with news of an unexpected inheritance. Later, after Caroline and Dr. Washington had departed for their hotel and Emma had retired to her room in the caretaker's cottage, James found himself drawn back to Charles's study. The room remained much as it had been during Charles's lifetime, though now it also served as an exhibit space where visitors could see where the heir had first discovered clues to the hidden collection. James settled into the leather chair behind the desk, running his fingers over the wood grain just as he had that first day. So much had changed, yet the essential character of the place remained, a space for reflection and purpose, for grappling with the past and planning for the future. On the desk lay a leather-bound book, the visitor's log from the Washington Legacy Center. James flipped through it, reading comments from recent guests. Thank you for showing how history can be honored truthfully, even the difficult parts. As a descendant of enslaved people in Virginia, seeing the Washington family's story validated gives me hope for recognition of my own family's history. My fourth-grade students were inspired by the interactive exhibits. They're now researching untold stories in our own community. James smiled at this tangible evidence of impact. The Everett legacy was no longer confined to family history or private papers. It had become a catalyst for broader understanding and reconciliation. His phone chimed with a text from Lieutenant Garcia. Thought you'd want to know. Another Thornfield descendant came forward today. Claims an ancestor had jewelry in the collection. James wasn't surprised. As word of the reconciliation efforts spread, more families had begun exploring their own connections to the Confederate collection. Some claims were legitimate, others less so, but each was investigated thoroughly by the Foundation's research team. Send them the standard documentation package, he replied. We'll look into it. Another message followed, this one from Harrington. Pierce's attorney contacted me. He wants to meet with you before sentencing. Says he has information about additional items taken from the collection. James frowned. Pierce had maintained throughout his trial that he had returned everything he'd taken. But James had always suspected there might be more. What game was the former trustee playing now? I'll think about it, he texted back. Whatever Pierce wanted, it could wait until morning. James locked the study and walked through the quiet halls of Everett Hall, now peaceful in the late evening. Through the windows, he could see the illuminated path leading to Thornfield Hall and the Washington Legacy Center between them, a physical manifestation of the connection between once divided histories. In the main hall, the grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time just as it had for generations. James paused before it, remembering the moment they discovered the hidden compartment and the freedom document within. That discovery had been the true turning point, the moment when Charles's plan had fully revealed itself and James had understood his role in fulfilling it. He continued outside, walking the now familiar path to the caretaker's cottage. The night was clear, stars visible above the ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of Virginia history, the glory and the shame, the betrayals and attempts at redemption. Inside the cottage, he found Emma still awake, working on her dissertation at the kitchen table. "How's it coming?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of water. "Pretty well," she replied, pushing back from her laptop. "I'm using the Everett Washington reconciliation as a case study, examining how family histories intersect with national narratives of justice and responsibility." James smiled. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Em. She always knew you had a brilliant mind." "She'd be proud of both of us," Emma countered. "Taking an unexpected inheritance and turning it into something meaningful instead of just living off the wealth." "Speaking of which," James said, sitting across from her, "I got a message from Harrington. Pierce wants to meet before his sentencing. Says he has information about other items taken from the collection." Emma's expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" "Hard to say. Could be a ploy for leniency, or he might actually have information worth hearing." "Either way, it's just another chapter in the story, isn't it?" Emma observed. "This legacy keeps unfolding, revealing new dimensions." James nodded, thinking of all they'd discovered over the past year. Not just artifacts and historical truths, but insights into human nature, into how the past continues to shape the present, into how even long-buried injustices can eventually find redress. "Charles understood something profound," he said after a moment. "He knew that wealth and property weren't enough of a legacy. He wanted to leave behind something more meaningful, a path to redemption, not just for himself, but for generations of Everetts who benefited from that initial betrayal. And he trusted that the right heir would recognize that path and follow it," Emma added, "even if that heir turned out to be a contractor with no connection to the Everett bloodline beyond a distant great-grandmother." James smiled at her summary. "When you put it that way, it sounds almost absurd." "But it worked," Emma pointed out, "because Charles understood what was essential. He looked beyond superficial qualifications to character, to the kind of person who would value craftsmanship, who would notice the hidden compartment in the desk or the secret drawer in the grandfather clock." "A person with calloused hands," James mused, looking down at his own. Despite a year of managing the foundation and complex, his hands still bore the marks of his years as a contractor. He wouldn't have it any other way. The following morning, James rose early and drove to the construction site of the Washington Legacy Center's newest addition, an archive and research facility that would house documents related to Virginia's Reconstruction era, including the Washington family's freedom paper and other materials from the Confederate collection. The building was taking shape nicely, its modern design complementing rather than competing with the historical structures nearby. James walked the site with the project manager, discussing adjustments to the HVAC system that would better protect delicate historical documents. "We can modify the humidity controls in the main archive room," the manager suggested, "but it will add about $30,000 to the budget." "Do it," James approved without hesitation. "These documents have survived 150 years. I want them preserved for at least 150 more." As he inspected the construction, James reflected on how his contracting background had proved invaluable in overseeing the complex expansion. He understood blueprints and building materials, could spot potential issues before they became problems, and wasn't intimidated by contractors trying to cut corners or inflate costs. By mid-morning, he was back at Everett Hall for his scheduled meeting with Harrington to sign the Thornfield Hall Trust documents. The lawyer arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a younger associate who carried the substantial paperwork. "Once executed, these documents will ensure Thornfield Hall remains a historical and educational facility in perpetuity," Harrington explained as James reviewed the final agreements. "The Washington Legacy Center will maintain operational control, with oversight from the board we've established." "And the Sullivan family's position is secured," James confirmed. referring to the provision guaranteeing that Robert and Abigail Sullivan would continue as resident caretakers for their lifetimes. Yes, as specified, Harrington confirmed, they'll have lifetime rights to the caretaker's cottage and employment with the trust if they so choose. Satisfied, James signed it where indicated, finalizing the arrangement that would protect Thornfield Hall's future regardless of what happened to the rest of the Everett estate. "Have you decided about meeting with Pierce?" Harrington asked as they concluded their business. "I'll see him," James decided. "Whatever his game, I'd rather know what he's planning than be surprised later." Harrington nodded approvingly. "Wise approach." His attorney suggested tomorrow morning at the detention center. "I can arrange it if you wish." After confirming the details, James headed to the Washington Legacy Center, where the symposium's second day was underway. He slipped into the back of a session on material restitution in historical context, where Dr. Washington was presenting the Everett Washington case alongside other examples of historical reconciliation efforts. Caroline sat a few rows ahead, taking notes. She had embraced her connection to the Everett legacy with enthusiasm, planning to spend several weeks in Virginia researching her grandfather's life and contributions. Her architectural expertise had already proved valuable as they developed plans for the archive building, and she had formed a warm friendship with Emma over their shared interest in historical research. As the session concluded, James joined them for lunch in the center's cafe, where they were soon approached by a reporter from the Washington Post who was covering the symposium. "Mr. Marshall, I wonder if I might ask you a few questions for our Sunday feature on historical reconciliation efforts." James agreed, though he still found media attention somewhat uncomfortable. The reporter's questions were thoughtful, focusing on the broader implications of the Everett-Washington reconciliation rather than the sensationalistic aspects that had dominated early coverage. "Some critics have suggested that what you've done here, while commendable, is too small scale to serve as a model for national reconciliation efforts," the reporter noted. "How would you respond to that?" James considered his answer carefully. "I'd say they're missing the point. Reconciliation isn't primarily about scale, it's about authenticity and specificity. The Washington family's claim could be addressed directly because we had documentation, living descendants, and resources specifically set aside for restitution." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "National-level reconciliation is necessary and important, but it will necessarily look different from what we've done here. What might be transferable is the approach. Acknowledge specific harms, center the experiences and wishes of those harmed, and commit to ongoing relationship rather than one-time payments or symbolic gestures." The reporter seemed satisfied with this response, jotting notes before moving on to ask Caroline about her discovery of her connection to Charles Everett. As the afternoon progressed, James found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of the upcoming meeting with Pierce. What could the former trustee possibly offer now, after months of legal proceedings and investigations? Was it a genuine attempt to make amends, or another manipulation? That evening, as visitors departed and staff closed the various facilities for the day, James walked the grounds alone, trying to clear his mind. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from nearby farms. The beauty of the Virginia countryside still moved him, even after a year of living among its rolling hills and ancient forests. He found himself at the small cemetery on the edge of the Everett property, where generations of the family were buried. Charles's grave was marked by a simple headstone, in keeping with the man's unassuming nature despite his wealth and position. James stood before it, hands in his pockets against the evening chill. "I think you'd be pleased," he said quietly to the stone. "The Washington family has received justice. The collection is being preserved and studied, and the Everett name is associated with reconciliation rather than betrayal." He smiled slightly. "You chose a complicated path, Charles, but I understand why now. Some legacies can't be passed on directly. They have to be discovered, piece by someone willing to follow the trail wherever it leads." As darkness fell, James made his way back to the caretaker's cottage, where Emma and Caroline were deep in conversation over cups of tea. Their easy rapport reminded him of Mary. Both women had her quick intelligence and warmth. "How are you feeling about seeing Pierce tomorrow?" Emma asked as he joined them. "Curious mostly," James replied. Whatever he's offering, it can't change what we've accomplished here. Carolyn nodded. The foundation is established. The center is operating. The trusts are in place. Whatever game Pierce is playing, he's lost the larger battle. Still, James said thoughtfully, I want to hear what he has to say. Every piece of the collection we recover adds to the historical record, helps us understand what really happened in those final days of the Confederacy, and gives us more opportunities to right historical wrongs, Emma added. Exactly, James agreed. That's the true Everett legacy now, not wealth or status, but the ongoing work of reconciliation and truth-telling. As night settled over the Everett, Washington historical complex, James felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with a foreclosure notice and an unexpected visitor had led to something far more meaningful than financial security. It had led to purpose, to connection across time and bloodlines, to the fulfillment of a vision that had waited decades for the right moment and the right heir. Whatever Pierce might reveal tomorrow, whatever new chapters might unfold in the Everett legacy, the foundation had been laid for something lasting, a model of how history's wounds might be acknowledged and addressed with honesty and grace. And for James Marshall, once a struggling contractor and now the steward of a remarkable historical reconciliation, that was legacy enough.